Welcome back again. Please, before we start, comment down below where you are and what time it is there right now. Let's get to it. Shannon Gilbert was just 23 years old when she vanished on the morning of May 1st, 2010. A hopeful young woman, originally from Jersey City, New Jersey, Shannon worked as an escort, advertising her services on Craigslist. Despite her line of work, she had ambitions beyond it. She dreamed of becoming a singer and had been saving money to help her pursue that goal. Friends and family noted her determination, though they also admitted Shannon had her struggles. She was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and occasionally missed taking her prescribed medication. On the night of her disappearance, though, it wasn't her past struggles or aspirations that took center stage. It was the growing fear in her voice as she made what would become one of the most haunting 911 calls in modern crime history. Shannon was last seen in a gated community in Oak Beach, a quiet, middle-class neighborhood on Long Island's South Shore. That evening, she had been accompanied by her driver, Michael Pack, as part of her work arrangement. In this line of work, it was not unusual to have someone drive and wait nearby to ensure a semblance of security. She had arranged to meet a client named Joseph Brewer, a local resident who lived in this suburban enclave. What exactly happened during their interaction remains unclear, but by the early hours of the morning, Shannon was terrified. At 4:51 a.m., she placed a frantic call to 911, claiming someone was after her. The call stretched on for over 20 minutes. In the chilling audio, Shannon's voice wavered between panic and exhaustion. She repeatedly told the dispatcher, "They're going to kill me," though she didn't provide much clarity on who they were. Her fear was palpable, a kind of raw vulnerability that sticks with you when you hear it. The Suffolk County Police Department, who later made the audio available to the public after years of legal battles, initially treated the call as a low-priority matter. But for Shannon, this was the last lifeline she would grab onto before vanishing into the cold morning air. It is said that during the call, she mentioned both Brewer and Pack, though neither man was charged in relation to her disappearance. Their accounts of that night were inconsistent yet strangely untethered to the gravity of what ended up happening. While on the phone, Shannon left Brewer's house abruptly and began knocking on neighboring doors, pleading for help. At one point, she reached the house of Gus Coletti, an older gentleman who answered her frantic knocks. He later recalled that Shannon looked disoriented and scared, refusing to step inside when he opened the door. Instead, she stood on his porch, glancing over her shoulder, as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. Coletti tried to offer assistance, even calling 911 himself after she bolted from his home. Another neighbor, Barbara Brennan, reportedly saw Shannon running across her yard, still in distress. These accounts painted an unsettling picture of a woman desperate to escape something, or someone, unknown. By 5:30 a.m., Shannon was gone. Witnesses claimed to have seen her run into the marshy wetlands near Oak Beach, a tangle of tall grass and uneven terrain difficult to navigate even in daylight. When police finally arrived, her absence was written off as a case of a woman fleeing into the night, the subtext being that her job somehow made her disappearance less urgent. She was dismissed, not as a victim but as someone who had simply wandered off in a highly emotional state. Yet, her family refused to accept this narrative and immediately began pushing for a more thorough investigation. For Mari Gilbert, Shannon's mother, the lack of urgency in those early hours only deepened her resolve to uncover the truth about what happened to her daughter. The Suffolk County Police Department didn't treat the case with the seriousness it would later demand. Their initial theory was that Shannon had become disoriented and drowned in the marsh, possibly due to her mental health condition or substances, though there was little evidence to support this assumption at the time. Few officers took into account her documented fear on the 911 call, or her very clear actions of running and seeking help. This casual dismissal would set the stage for years of frustration amongst Shannon's family, particularly Mari, who grew increasingly vocal about law enforcement's apparent apathy. As Mari publicized her daughter's story, she told reporters and investigators, if this were anyone else's child, they'd be looking by now. Months later, due largely to Mari's persistence, law enforcement launched a more coordinated search for Shannon in December 2010. The effort initially focused on ending her within a tight radius of where she was last seen. During one of these searches, on an unassuming stretch of Gilgo Beach, not far from Oak Beach, investigators stumbled upon the remains of a woman. The chilling part? They weren't Shannon's remains. Instead, during that search on December 11, officers found the skeletal remains of another woman wrapped in burlap. What should have been an isolated, tragic discovery quickly unraveled into something far darker when, over the subsequent days, 3 more sets of remains were discovered in the same area, all within 500 feet of one another. Each belonged to a young woman, all petite, all in their 20s, and all escorts who, like Shannon, advertised their services online. This grouping of victims, later dubbed the Gilgo Four, turned Shannon's disappearance from a quiet local case into the beginnings of one of America's most notorious unsolved serial killer investigations. The Suffolk County Homicide Squad, once reluctant to devote resources, now found themselves at the epicenter of a growing nightmare. Despite the proximity of the remains, missing persons reports for each of the Gilgo Four had previously been dealt with as unrelated cases. It was only their discovery along Ocean Parkway that forced law enforcement to reckon with a deeply unsettling reality. The Long Island serial killer was likely at work, and Shannon Gilbert's disappearance had shone a spotlight on the hidden dangers lurking just beyond the shoreline. Yet, in this newly unearthed horror, Shannon herself remained missing. With public fear mounting, investigators slowly expanded their efforts, combing through rough terrain with dogs and equipment, while combing through victim reports and online advertisements. Still, it wasn't until December 2011, over a year and a half after her disappearance, that skeletal remains later confirmed to be Shannon's were located in Oak Beach, the same area she had vanished. Her body was also recovered in the marsh near her belongings. A cell phone, credit cards, and jeans. All were scattered in a way that raised questions. Forensic analysis of Shannon's remains proved inconclusive regarding a cause of death. Full skeletal remains make certain conclusions harder to draw than soft tissues might. The Suffolk County Medical Examiner ruled her case inconclusive, leaving the door open to various theories. Did she meet an accidental death in the marsh, trapped by thick mud and sharp reeds, as some believed, or had she become an early victim of the Long Island serial killer, only to be brought to her watery grave? While the questions surrounding Shannon persist, her story lit a fuse. The chilling echoes of her 911 call, which captured both her determination to survive and her overwhelming fear, had become tethered to the larger discovery of what lay beneath the sands of Gilgo Beach. Yet for investigators, this was only the beginning. Shannon's disappearance was an entry point to a harrowing larger truth, one that would take years to unravel and even further propel more mysteries into the public eye. As we shift to exploring the grim discoveries at Gilgo Beach in the aftermath of this search, keep one thing in mind. Shannon Gilbert was searching for help that night. Her cries were heard, but not heeded in time. And as her story collided with those whose cries came before her, it became impossible for anyone paying attention to ignore the silence that enveloped Long Island's most vulnerable victims. The search for Shannon Gilbert expanded methodically across the area surrounding Gilgo Beach in December 2010. After months of stagnation, police had finally committed significant resources to locating her. Officers swept through the marshy terrain with cadaver dogs and other specialized equipment, navigating the cold and unforgiving environment. The sand dunes and thick vegetation of the Long Island shoreline created a quiet, desolate backdrop for their efforts. At first, it was an organized search for a single missing person, but what they discovered would transform the investigation entirely, and it wouldn't start with finding Shannon. On the morning of December 11, 2010, a canine officer leading his dog made a chilling discovery along Ocean Parkway, not far from where Shannon was last seen. Lying partially hidden amidst the brush was what appeared to be human remains. The body hadn't been there recently. This was skeletal material, and it had been wrapped carefully in burlap. This revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation. Despite initial hopes, it was quickly confirmed that the remains were not Shannon Gilbert's. This was someone else, and within days, searchers realized there was more to uncover. By December 13, police had expanded the search area and unearthed 3 additional sets of remains, each in similar conditions. Identified in early 2011, these 4 victims came to be known as the Gilgo Four: Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, and Amber Costello. Authorities confirmed that each woman had disappeared between 2007 and 2010, years before Shannon's case had even brought them back to the area. Their disappearances, all initially treated as isolated incidents, were now linked through this devastating discovery. Maureen Brainerd Barnes was the first of the Gilgo Four to vanish. She had disappeared in July 2007 while in New York City for work. A single mother from Connecticut, Maureen had been struggling to make ends meet. She had advertised on Craigslist like so many others in her line of work, and her desperation to provide for her children left her vulnerable. Her remains were among those found wrapped in burlap, suggesting a calculated and deliberate crime scene disposal. Melissa Barthelemy disappeared in July 2009 at the age of 24. Originally from Buffalo, New York, Melissa had moved to the Bronx, hoping for a fresh start. To fund her ambitions, she worked as an escort, also using Craigslist to connect with clients. Melissa's case stood out to investigators because, after her disappearance, her family experienced a horrifying ordeal. Her teenage sister, Amanda, received multiple calls from someone using Melissa's phone. In each call, the man taunted Amanda, asking if she knew where her sister was. His voice was calm and emotionless. The details he provided showed he had likely been involved in Melissa's fate, yet the use of burner phones and the lack of tracing technology at the time left police with no way to track him. Megan Waterman was only 22 when she disappeared in June 2010. A mother to a young daughter, Megan came from Scarborough, Maine. She too relied on Craigslist to advertise her services and had left her home to meet someone in Long Island the night she vanished. Her family had reported her missing and repeatedly informed police of the dangers her job posed. Yet, like the others, Megan's case attracted little attention at the time. Now her remains joined those of 3 other women discovered in the same cluster. Amber Costello, the youngest of the Gilgo Four, was 27 when she went missing in September 2010. A native of North Carolina, Amber had settled in West Babylon, New York, where she lived with roommates. Described as kind-hearted and trusting, she often put her own safety at risk to support those she cared about. Amber, like the others, had advertised her services online. Her roommates later told police that Amber had left their home one evening, saying she was meeting a client. It was the last time she was seen alive. Her body, like the others, was found near Ocean Parkway. Though their stories varied, the Gilgo Four shared haunting similarities. Each of them was petite, standing around 5 feet tall and weighing close to 100 pounds. They were all in their 20s when they disappeared and had been working as escorts, advertising primarily on Craigslist. Wrapping their bodies in burlap suggested a level of care and uniformity, likely meant to avoid immediate detection. Each victim's remains had been placed within 500 feet of one another, a proximity that made it clear this wasn't random. According to Dominic Verone, then Chief of Detectives for Suffolk County, the connections between the women pointed to a deliberate targeting pattern. Whoever was responsible had chosen them carefully, luring them with crafted messages and controlled interactions. The use of burner phones only reinforced this profile. The oceanfront location of their disposal was another grim detail. Gilgo Beach sits along a stretch of barrier islands that separate Long Island from the Atlantic Ocean. It's a scenic but eerily isolated area, where sprawling marshlands meet desolate beaches. The remoteness provided whoever was responsible with a secluded dumping ground. Yet even among all the details, the burlap wrapping stood out. It wasn't entirely common, and for investigators, it suggested a methodical killer, someone who planned his movements and intentionally left little evidence behind. Beyond the physical details, the emotional impact on the community began to grow. The realization that a serial killer might be operating on Long Island sent waves of fear through the area. Families of missing women working in the same profession began to fear the worst. Advocacy groups criticized police for their initial dismissiveness, not just in Shannon Gilbert's case but in others like it. As the news of the Gilgo Four broke, public speculation swirled. People wondered how long had this killer been active? How many more victims could there be? And why had so little attention been given to the disappearances of these women before now? Law enforcement began to face the uncomfortable questions that had been building for years. Many observed that the victims, as escorts, occupied a vulnerable space in society, one often overlooked by police and the public alike. Their reliance on online platforms like Craigslist, where anonymity was easily maintained, added another layer of difficulty to tracking their movements or identifying their last contacts. Still, it was clear there was a predator out there somewhere, someone who had exploited that vulnerability to deadly effect. For years, the disappearances of women like Maureen, Melissa, Megan, and Amber had been treated with little urgency. Now, their deaths forced Suffolk County to confront the magnitude of what had been missed. As news spread, the term Long Island serial killer began to circulate in media coverage. Yet even as police ramped up their efforts, many in the community started wondering if this killer had been hiding in plain sight all along. The scope of the area meant it was easy for someone familiar with the geography to remain unseen. Ocean Parkway itself stretches for miles, lined by tall reeds and patches of forest, making certain parts nearly impossible to search thoroughly. Investigators expanded their efforts, but challenges piled up quickly. The physical environment, coupled with the time that had elapsed since the women's deaths, made the task of gathering evidence incredibly difficult. Despite these obstacles, the discovery of the Gilgo Four was a turning point. What began as a search for a single missing woman had spiraled into a homicide investigation of unprecedented scale for Suffolk County. The realization that the beach could be doubling as a burial ground left an eerie stain on an otherwise quiet area. It wasn't just about these 4 victims. There was growing suspicion, among the community and investigators alike, that more bodies might be waiting to be found. Authorities shifted their focus, trying to piece together the killer's pattern. Who was he? How was he selecting his victims? And perhaps most haunting of all, was he still active? The search of Gilgo Beach had opened a door to a darker world, one filled with unanswered questions that would only grow more complex as time went on. For now, investigators could only press forward, unsure of just how expansive this case would ultimately become. The lives of the Gilgo Four, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello, were distinct in many ways. Yet, the circumstances that united their tragic fates were disturbingly similar. All were young women, petite in stature, who had turned to the internet to work as escorts. They sought clients using Craigslist, a platform that promised opportunity, but also exposed them to dangers hidden behind digital anonymity. Living on society's margins, their disappearances were largely overlooked at first, treated as isolated incidents rather than pieces of a larger, coordinated pattern. But the discovery of their remains along Gilgo Beach in December 2010 connected them in ways no one could ignore. Maureen Brainerd Barnes, in many ways, was the beginning of this unsettling story. A native of Norwich, Connecticut, she was the first of the Gilgo Four to go missing. Maureen was 25 at the time and a single mother of 2 children. Despite her challenges, friends and family described her as determined and resourceful. She had begun working as an escort out of financial necessity, hoping to secure a stable life for her young family. On July 9, 2007, Maureen spoke to her sister Missy Can by phone from New York City. She mentioned she might return home that evening on a late train. That call was the last contact anyone had with her. For her family, the weeks that followed were agonizing. Maureen had always kept in close touch, so her sudden silence signaled something was terribly wrong. But her status as an escort complicated her case. Maureen quickly became another name among missing persons reports without immediate follow-up. 2 years later, in 2009, the story took a horrifying twist with Melissa Barthelemy's disappearance. At the age of 24, Melissa had moved from Buffalo to New York City, where she dreamed of making it as a hairdresser. To support herself, she worked as an escort, relying on Craigslist like Maureen had. Melissa's case gained national attention not for what was found, but for what happened in the days after her family reported her missing. Nearly a week after her disappearance, Melissa's younger sister Amanda began receiving taunting phone calls. These came from Melissa's phone, as if the older sister herself were calling, but it wasn't Melissa's voice on the other end. It was a man, calm and deliberate, telling Amanda he had killed Melissa. The calls continued for weeks, always laced with cruel remarks and horrifying details about her fate. The teenager begged for answers, but the man offered none. Officials traced the calls to Manhattan, but they were short and made from bustling public areas, preventing any attempt to pinpoint the perpetrator. Melissa's murder underscored the chilling approach of whoever was behind these acts. The phone calls weren't just a way to gloat, they were designed to instill fear, turning the family's grief into absolute terror. The killer didn't simply take life. He aimed to dismantle the lives of those left behind. Melissa's case became emblematic of the calculated and taunting behavior that would later define the Long Island serial killer's profile. Megan Waterman disappeared the following year, in 2010, a 22-year-old mother from Scarborough, Maine. Megan was known for her outgoing personality and fierce love for her young daughter, who was just 3 at the time. Megan had recently traveled to Long Island with her boyfriend, who she described as controlling. She had been working as an escort to support herself and her child, often turning to Craigslist to find clients. Megan's last known movements were captured in surveillance footage from a Holiday Inn in Hauppauge, New York. The video showed her walking out of the hotel alone, wearing casual clothing, her hair loose around her shoulders. It was the last time she was seen alive. Family members reported her missing shortly afterward, but like Maureen and Melissa, the circumstances of her work seemed to affect the urgency of the response. She became another tragic name on a growing list, one that no one had yet connected. The last of the Gilgo Four, Amber Costello, vanished in September 2010. At 27, Amber was the eldest of the group, but carried an air of vulnerability that her family often worried about. Originally from North Carolina, she had moved to Long Island, where she lived in West Babylon with her roommates. Amber had struggled with addiction, but was deeply loved by those who knew her. She had begun working as an escort to support herself and relied heavily on Craigslist to find clients. On the night of September 2, 2010, Amber told her roommate Dave Schaller that she was meeting a client who had offered her a much higher payment than usual, 1,500, significantly above her going rate. The man had specifically mentioned meeting her alone, which in hindsight raised questions about his intentions. Challa later described the client as looking like an ogre and recalled that he drove a Chevrolet Avalanche, a detail that would eventually prove crucial to the case. Amber left that night and never returned, her bubbly demeanor now only a memory to those she left behind. For all four women, the use of burner phones became a recurring, eerie thread. The killer had contacted each of them through disposable phones, keeping his tracks covered and erasing any direct way to connect their last known interactions to him. Craigslist, which many escorts used due to its wide reach, provided a perfect cloak of anonymity. Officials later learned that the burner phones used to contact the women had often pinged cell towers near Massapequa Park, Long Island. The killer's knowledge of these tools, burner phones, digital platforms, secluded locations hinted at someone who took deliberate steps to stay one step ahead of investigators. The similarities between the victims were impossible to ignore. Their ages and builds, all petite women in their 20s, were likely not coincidences. They came from different backgrounds but shared a vulnerability rooted in their circumstances. Being escorts, they existed in a profession often stigmatized and treated with suspicion. Even as their cases mounted, the lack of urgency in investigating their disappearances reflected the broader societal biases against sex workers. It allowed their killer to continue undetected, perfecting his methods over time. What stood out most was how methodical the killer seemed to be. He wasn't impulsive or sloppy. The burlap used to wrap the victims' bodies, for instance, suggested preparation, a willingness to plan the details of each crime in advance. It also pointed to someone who knew how to blend into his surroundings, acting unseen in an area frequented by locals and visitors. The precise location of the bodies, tightly clustered along a quiet stretch of Gilgo Beach, spoke to repetition and routine. Whoever it was knew that stretch of land intimately, enough to use it as a dumping ground for years without drawing attention. The discovery of the Gilgo Four's remains forced investigators to rethink everything. This wasn't a single crime of opportunity or a volatile act. This was deliberate, calculated. Someone had carefully selected these women, targeted their vulnerabilities, and carried out his crimes with chilling precision. The burlap sacks, the burner phones, the taunting calls, all of it pointed to a killer confident in his ability to evade capture. But as the families of the victims mourned, investigators hit a wall. Despite the pattern emerging, there was little physical evidence to connect anyone to the crimes. The killer's trail was cold, concealed by years of anonymity and forethought. Even as the community grew more fearful, law enforcement struggled to make progress. Leads dried up, and unanswered questions lingered. Was the killer still out there? And if so, when would he strike again? For now, all detectives could do was piece together the fragments, hoping something new would surface to break the deadlock. Following the discovery of the Gilgo 4 in December 2010, the investigation faced immediate challenges that set the stage for nearly a decade of frustrating stagnation. Law enforcement now had evidence of at least one serial killer operating in the area, but connecting these cases was far more difficult than it seemed. Each of the four women had gone missing on separate dates, and the years of separation between their disappearances created an obstacle for finding a cohesive thread. Additionally, the women had been reported missing from different states, including Connecticut, New York, and Maine, so their cases were investigated in separate jurisdictions. The Suffolk County Police Department suddenly found itself tasked with untangling years of fragmented, incomplete information, all while facing scrutiny about why it had taken so long to determine a pattern. One of the major issues early on was a lack of hard evidence. The remains of the Gilgo 4 were skeletal when discovered, leaving few forensic leads to analyze. Without soft tissue, determination of time of death, manner of death, or even environmental clues was difficult. Even the burlap used to wrap the bodies, while distinctive, yielded no usable DNA or material evidence. Leads dried up quickly. Burner phones used to contact the women added a layer of anonymity for the killer, and their movements before disappearing left no surveillance footage or witness accounts to pinpoint their final moments. Investigators combed through records, but the tools available in 2010 could not discern much from scattered digital signals. The gaps left holes big enough to stall the case indefinitely. In the months after the discovery, Suffolk County Police expanded their search around Gilgo Beach and along Ocean Parkway, uncovering additional bodies. These remains included victims who did not fit the same profile as the Gilgo 4, a toddler, an unidentified man, and women whose connections to the original cases were not clear. The public started to grapple with the idea that Long Island had become a dumping ground, but even as the body count rose, no solid clues emerged. The possibility of multiple killers, either working simultaneously or over time, complicated the focus of the investigation. This uncertainty made it challenging to determine whether similar victims should even be attributed to one person. Adding to these difficulties was Suffolk County's internal turmoil. In 2011, James Burke became the new chief of police, and his leadership would prove to be a pivotal, albeit controversial, factor in the investigation's future or lack thereof. Burke quickly came under scrutiny for withholding information, sidelining experienced officers, and failing to cooperate with federal agencies like the FBI. Key evidence that could have benefited from broader expertise remained within Suffolk County's jurisdiction, effectively cut off from the additional resources it needed. To make matters worse, Burke himself became embroiled in legal scandals, including allegations of abuse of power and obstruction of justice. His tenure created a culture of mistrust within the department, derailing any sense of cohesion among investigative teams. By the time he resigned in 2015, years of missteps and distractions had left the case colder than ever. The lack of technological advancements at the time also hindered progress. In 2010, cell phone data analysis was still in its early stages compared to today's capabilities. The records available from the burner phones used to lure the victims lacked the precision to pinpoint the killer's location or identity. This gap created a timeline where investigators could only piece together fragments of movement. Cell towers pinged in areas like Massapequa Park, but they revealed no specifics. Similarly, advances in DNA analysis were not fully available during the initial years of the investigation. Hair strands, fibers, and other materials found among the victims remained unanalyzed until later, when improved technology finally gave them renewed relevance. In the meantime, though, these potential breakthroughs sat in evidence lockers, collecting dust. As the years dragged on, public frustration swelled. Families of the victims felt abandoned, often expressing anger at how law enforcement had treated their loved ones from the start. For Mari Gilbert, Shannon Gilbert's mother, the lack of action from authorities felt like a reflection of how society viewed women like Shannon and the rest of the Gilgo Four. Their work as escorts seemed to diminish the urgency of their cases in the eyes of the police, a reality that Mari confronted openly and repeatedly. If this was someone else's daughter, she argued in interviews, they would have done something sooner. Advocacy groups and media outlets began picking up on this sentiment, pointing out the systemic neglect of sex workers and other marginalized individuals in missing persons cases. The disparities in investigative priorities were glaring, further eroding trust between the community and law enforcement. In the absence of tangible progress, rumors and speculation filled the void. The idea that a serial killer was still active grew into an ominous undercurrent of fear. By 2015, 5 years after the first bodies were uncovered, there was no confirmed suspect, no arrest, and no discernible progress. Residents of Long Island began to wonder if the killer was someone they knew, a neighbor, a co-worker, perhaps even someone in a position of authority. The lack of resolution cast a shadow over the quiet coastal community. Every unsolved disappearance or tragic death of a woman along the eastern seaboard fueled theories that the Long Island serial killer could be responsible. Competing priorities within law enforcement also contributed to the case's stagnation. Suffolk County officers were often juggling multiple investigations, from organized crime to drug-related offenses, and the resources dedicated to the Gilgo Beach case were sometimes stretched thin. In some years, staffing levels for cold case units were insufficient to handle such a sprawling and complex investigation. Without progress, the case began slipping further down the list of priorities. This dynamic left families feeling as though their loved ones' stories were being forgotten, lost in the shuffle of bureaucratic delays and shifting leadership. So, as the investigation stalled, the narrative became one of missed opportunities and fading hope. The prospect of the killer striking again lingered in the minds of victims' families and the public alike. And while officials occasionally released vague updates about reviewing evidence or reopening leads, these efforts never seemed to materialize into anything concrete. Interviews with officials often came across as speculative rather than informative, further leaving the community in the dark. By the mid-2010s, the investigation into the Long Island serial killer felt frozen in time, trapped between outdated evidence and systemic flaws. Even with new technology rolling out, it seemed Suffolk County was slow to apply it to the case. This paralysis only deepened the fears that the killer might still be active, perhaps adapting to evade detection in an age when digital footprints were harder to erase. The haunting possibility of a predator still lurking heightened the emotional weight of the case, turning it into a spectre that loomed over Long Island. For the families, though, this was not about fear or speculation, it was about justice. Yet justice seemed farther away than ever. Despite the overwhelming sense of hopelessness, something shifted in the late 2010s. New leadership, fresh perspectives, and advancements in forensic technology began to breathe life back into the Gilgo Beach case. After a decade of silence, the Suffolk County Police Department announced renewed efforts to review evidence with a focus on modern methodologies. Items once deemed insignificant, including burner phone data, fibers, and hairs, were revisited with the latest tools, offering promise where none had existed before. By 2020, whispers of progress began to emerge, hinting that the years of waiting might not have been in vain. The question hanging in the air remained: could time and innovation unlock the secrets of a case that had confounded investigators for so long? Though the past decade provided few answers, it was becoming clear that the story of the Long Island serial killer was not over. For the first time in years, hope flickered on the horizon. After years of frustration and dead ends, the formation of a new task force in February 2022 marked a critical turning point in the Long Island serial killer investigation. This renewed effort was spearheaded by Suffolk County Police Commissioner Rodney Harrison and Suffolk County District Attorney Ray Tierney. Their goal was clear: to apply modern technology, fresh perspectives, and focused resources to a case that had grown stagnant since the discovery of the Gilgo 4 more than a decade earlier. The task force wasted no time. One of their first steps was a meticulous review of old case files, many of which had been scattered or underutilized during earlier investigative efforts. Over the years, leads had been overlooked and connections remained unexamined. But with technological advances that weren't available when the investigation began, the team now had tools to analyze evidence in ways that had been impossible in the past. This detailed approach brought long-forgotten details back into focus, details that would soon prove essential to identifying a suspect. A pivotal clue came from Amber Costello's case, specifically the account provided by her roommate, Dave Schaller. Back in 2010, Schaller had described the man Amber went to meet on the night she disappeared, recalling his intimidating stature and a face he said was like an ogre. Schaller also remembered something most wouldn't. The man had driven a first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche. While this detail had been noted in the investigation's early stages, it didn't lead anywhere at the time. Now, the task force saw potential in this detail, narrowing their search for anyone who fit the description and owned that particular vehicle model. At the same time, investigators turned their attention to phone records, an area where technology had vastly improved since the early years of the case. The use of burner phones to contact victims like Melissa Barthélemy had been a hallmark of the killer's tactics, keeping his activities hidden behind layers of anonymity. However, when the task force analyzed those phone records again, patterns began to emerge. They noticed a concentration of activity linked to a specific geographic area: Massapequa Park, Long Island. This small zone, nicknamed the Box, became a focal point for investigators, narrowing their search for suspects and resources. The combination of these two key details, the Chevrolet Avalanche and the geographic phone data, soon pointed the task force to a name that had never before come up in connection to the case: Rex Heuermann. A local architect, Heuermann lived and worked in Massapequa Park, right in the center of the area flagged by the burner phone activities. His profile raised immediate interest. Here was a man whose unassuming life and professional success allowed him to operate unnoticed while living close to the area where the victims' remains were found. The more investigators dug into his background, the more the pieces began to fit. With this new lead, the task force initiated surveillance on Heuermann to observe his behavior and gather further evidence. One key moment came when investigators spotted him entering a cell phone store. Heuermann made a payment on one of his burner phones, a critical mistake that gave investigators additional proof of his connection to the devices used to lure the Gilgo 4. This simple act of paying for the phone confirmed a direct link between him and the tools that tied him to the crimes. As investigators closed in on Heuermann, they also revisited evidence collected from the crime scenes. One significant breakthrough involved previously recovered hair. Early forensic examinations had been unable to extract usable DNA from the hair strands found near Megan Waterman's remains. However, with advancements in mitochondrial DNA analysis, these hairs could now be re-examined. The results linked the male hair found at the scene to Heuermann, further anchoring suspicions surrounding his involvement. What made the case even more damning was the connection between Heuermann's personal movements and the burner phone activity. Each time a victim was contacted, the burner phone pinged off cell towers in Massapequa Park, Investigators matched this activity to Hoyerman's work and residence locations. It was a pattern not easily explained away by coincidence. As this trail unfolded, more connections emerged, links between his technology use, his geographic footprint, and his potential access to a first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche. These revelations created a ripple effect for the families of the victims. For years, they had waited in agony, wondering if there would ever be answers. When news broke that a suspect had finally been identified, hope reignited among those closest to the case. For once, it feels like they're looking in the right direction, one family member said, expressing both relief and cautious optimism. Yet, even as they grasped for hope, the fear of another false start lingered in their minds. Would this be the moment when answers finally arrived, or would the trail go cold once again? By the summer of 2023, the task force gathered enough evidence to move forward decisively. The Chevrolet Avalanche, once a tiny detail buried in case files, became a cornerstone. Combined with the DNA evidence, surveillance footage, and detailed records of burner phone usage, investigators had built a solid case against Hoyerman. And it wasn't just his connection to the 4 women buried along Gilgo Beach. It was his actions, his deliberate planning, and the undeniable traces linking him to the scenes of these crimes. Rex Hoyerman was arrested in July 2023 in what became a monumental moment for one of the most elusive serial killer investigations in modern history. The evidence against him was staggering, shifting the investigation from years of uncertainty to solid ground. For the first time in over a decade, the families of the victims could begin to envision something they had almost given up hope on: justice. However, the arrest brought its own wave of questions and challenges. Would the evidence be enough to secure a conviction? And could Hoyerman be tied to other victims previously found near Gilgo Beach? This arrest wasn't the conclusion. It signaled the beginning of a new phase. Investigators and prosecutors now faced the daunting task of building a case strong enough to stand in court. Meanwhile, the community that had been haunted by this case for so long wrestled with the realization that the suspect had lived among them all along. As the investigation began its next chapter, one thing became clear. The brutal crimes along Gilgo Beach had finally been pulled back into the spotlight, no longer buried by years of oversight and missed opportunities. Justice, though late, felt one step closer. Rex Hoyerman appeared to be an ordinary man. A successful architect based in New York City, he ran his own firm out of an office in Midtown Manhattan. From the outside, his life seemed steady and unremarkable. He lived quietly in Massapequa Park, a residential town on Long Island, not far from the sandy stretches of beach that had become infamous for reasons few could comprehend. This proximity, both to the crime scenes and to the heart of New York City, was a fitting metaphor for how someone could live 2 lives, one visible, one hidden in the shadows. To those who worked with him professionally, Hoyerman might have seemed like any other accomplished architect. But in 2023, evidence surfaced suggesting that behind the facade of suburban normality lay a devastating truth. The arrest of Rex Hoyerman in July 2023 came after more than a decade of frustration and mystery surrounding the Gilgo Beach murders. All signs seemed to point to him as the elusive Long Island serial killer. Investigators had finally connected him to the crimes through a series of findings: burner phone records, eyewitness descriptions, a specific type of vehicle, and, perhaps most damningly, forensic evidence. Years of silence had been broken by methodical detective work and advances in technology, and now forgotten bits and pieces from an old case file were painting a picture that led directly to Hoyerman. One of the most critical pieces of evidence was the burner phones. The killer had a history of using disposable cell phones to contact his victims, women who worked as escorts and advertised their services online. These phones were shielded by anonymity, leaving little for investigators to track in the early 2010s. However, when Suffolk County's new task force reviewed this data with modern tools, a pattern began to emerge. The phones used to lure victims like Melissa Barthelemy and Amber Costello had repeatedly pinged cell towers near Massapequa Park, Hoyerman's hometown. This tiny detail trained the investigation's sights on a very small area, and on Hoyerman, who lived and worked within the range of those signals. It was a crack in the killer's armor, one that slowly began to widen. Another key piece of evidence was the first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche. This vehicle first came to investigators' attention over a decade earlier, during the investigation into Amber Costello's disappearance. On the night she vanished, Amber told her roommate she was heading to meet a client who had offered an unusually high payment, $500 in cash. The roommate, Dave Schaller, later described the client as an enormous man who resembled an ogre and drove a Chevy Avalanche. It was this detail, buried in early reports, that the task force dusted off when they reopened the case files. They discovered that during the time of the murders, Hoyerman had been the registered owner of such a vehicle. This connection was crucial not only because it matched Schaller's description, but because the car itself was later found on Hoyerman's property in South Carolina. After so many years, the avalanche had resurfaced, providing a direct link between Hoyerman's identity and Amber Costello's final client. Still, nothing was more conclusive than the DNA evidence. Investigators had recovered a male hair near Megan Waterman's remains, found wrapped in burlap and buried along Gilgo Beach. For years, this piece of evidence had been analysed, but yielded no results due to limitations in forensic technology. By 2023, mitochondrial DNA analysis had advanced enough to make more precise matches possible. But to connect the hair to Hoyerman, detectives needed a contemporary DNA sample from him. This brought them to Midtown Manhattan. Investigators followed Hoyerman closely, waiting for the right opportunity to obtain his DNA without his knowledge. The moment came when they spotted him discarding a pizza box in a trash can. It was a routine act, something anyone might do during an average workday. But for the task force, it represented the breakthrough they needed. From that discarded pizza crust, detectives extracted DNA and compared it to the profile obtained from the hair found with Megan Waterman's remains. The results were unmistakable. The DNA from the pizza and the DNA from the crime scene were a match. Years of uncertainty gave way to a hard link between Hoyerman and the murders. As damning as this evidence seemed, investigators were careful to build their case even further. They retraced every possible connection, overlaying Hoyerman's movements, phone records, and known associates against the timeline of the murders. They discovered that many of the burner phones used to contact the victims had been purchased in New York City, an area Hoyerman frequented for work. Payment records also tied back to him, solidifying his use of these devices and their role in coordinating meetings with his victims. News of his arrest on July 14, 2023, sent shockwaves across Long Island and far beyond. Hoyerman was charged with the murders of Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello. He was not immediately charged in connection with Maureen Brainard Barnes's death, though prosecutors named him as the prime suspect in her case as well. The focused charges suggested that law enforcement was intent on building a rock-solid case rather than overextending prematurely. Still, there was growing speculation about the other bodies found along Gilgo Beach and whether Hoyerman might be connected to more of them. Following his arrest, police executed extensive searches of Hoyerman's Massapequa Park home. Forensic teams combed through the property for 12 days, removing boxes of evidence and even digging in the backyard for potential additional remains or belongings tied to the victims. The Chevrolet Avalanche was seized, taken into custody as a piece of critical evidence in his alleged crimes. At the time of his arrest, Hoyerman also owned property in South Carolina and Las Vegas, both locations that have now become focal points for ongoing investigations to determine whether there may be other victims or if further evidence could be tied to those addresses. Hoyerman pleaded not guilty to the charges against him during his arraignment in Suffolk County Court. His defense team wasted no time in casting doubt on the evidence presented by prosecutors. His attorney, Michael Brown, stated publicly, "What has my client told me? He told me he didn't do this." Despite these claims, prosecutors stood firm, bolstered by the DNA match obtained both from the pizza crust and through a cheek swab administered after his arrest. As of September 27, 2023, this DNA had been reconfirmed in court as consistent with the hair recovered from the crime scene. Still, questions remain. Is the evidence enough to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt? The DNA match and circumstantial connections, burner phones, vehicle records, and witness descriptions give the prosecution a strong foundation. But, as any seasoned detective knows, trials hinge on how clearly a narrative can be delivered to a jury. Defense attorneys are likely to attack the reliability of some connections, focusing on the gaps caused by the passage of time. Meanwhile, the community that once felt haunted by an invisible threat now wrestles with the idea that the killer may have been hiding in plain sight. Hoyerman lived just miles from one of the most infamous crime scenes in modern history. He went to work, came home, and existed among neighbors who likely never suspected a thing. For those who followed the case for years, the gradual reveal of his life and movements evokes more unease than relief. Though the arrest of Rex Hoyerman answered many long-standing questions about the Long Island serial killer, it also reopened the door to a disturbing consideration. If he was responsible for these crimes, might there still be others? Investigators are now faced with determining whether his arrest marks the end of the case or merely another step in unraveling a twisted story that has haunted Long Island for over a decade. In May 2011, a chilling discovery brought the investigation at Gilgo Beach into even murkier territory. During an expanded search, law enforcement uncovered 6 additional sets of remains scattered along the same stretch of coastline. This brought the known total to 10 bodies, including the Gilgo 4, while the first 4 victims followed a clear, disturbing pattern. Young, petite women working as escorts. The aftermath of this discovery raised an unsettling question. Were all these victims tied to the same killer, or had the shoreline become a dumping ground for other predators operating in the shadows? Among the additional remains was Jessica Taylor, a 20-year-old escort from Washington, D.C., who had disappeared in 2003. Jessica's partial remains were first found that same year, over 40 miles away, in Manorville, Long Island. A torso had been discovered, left in the woods, but investigators could not identify her at the time. 8 years later, other parts of Jessica's body were found closer to Gilgo Beach. It was now clear that she had been one of the killer's targets, though the dispersion of her remains raised questions about the methods and motives behind her murder. Then came the discovery of Valerie Mack, also known as Jane Doe 6, until her identification in 2020 through DNA testing. Valerie, an escort and 24 years old at the time of her disappearance in 2000, had also been last seen in the Philadelphia area. Like Jessica Taylor, her remains were split between Manorville and Gilgo Beach. This distinctive pattern, partial torsos left inland, while other remains were deposited closer to the coastline, seemed to suggest a shift or evolution in the killer's behavior. Yet, it wasn't clear if this was intentional symbolism, a logistical decision, or something else entirely. Both cases hinted at more than one method of disposal, complicating efforts to link all the evidence to a single suspect. The diversity among the additional remains added further confusion to the case. One victim, known as Peaches, due to a tattoo of a peach found on her torso in 1997, would later be genetically confirmed as the mother of a toddler girl whose skeletal remains were also discovered near Gilgo Beach. A bond as intimate as motherhood made these cases particularly haunting. Yet both Peaches and her child remain unidentified, 2 victims whose stories have eluded both investigators and the public. Neither their connection to Hoyerman nor to any other suspect has been established. Even more perplexing was the discovery of an unidentified Asian male dressed in women's clothing. Authorities theorized that this individual might have been targeted for reasons unrelated to the others, potentially pointing to a wider range of victims or a more complex psychological driver behind these murders. Unlike the other remains, the male's cause of death appeared consistent with blunt force trauma, adding a disturbing new element to the killer's potential methods. Was this part of the same pattern, or a completely separate act of violence that just happened to end along the same shores? One of the oldest remains found belonged to Karen Vergata, another woman who had worked as an escort. Karen disappeared in 1996, and for decades she was known only as Jane Doe 7, until her identification was confirmed in 2023. Her presence among the victims drew the timeline of the case even further back in time, suggesting crimes that could span decades. If Hoyerman was responsible, had he begun killing in the mid-1990s? And if so, could there be even more crimes linked to him, predating or overlapping with these discoveries? The very fact that these victims lived different lives and disappeared at different times has led many experts to question whether there might be more than one killer. The Suffolk County Police Department raised this possibility early on, acknowledging that the disparities in victim profiles and methods of disposal could point to unrelated cases. Alternatively, they theorized, one person might have been responsible by tailoring their actions to evade detection. Forensic experts have even debated the mental profile of a potential suspect or suspects. Could one person's motive encompass this broad range of victims and methods? Or were multiple predators exploiting the same vulnerabilities and dumping ground? Complicating matters, investigators have since broadened their focus to encompass Rex Hoyerman's life outside Long Island. After his arrest in July 2023, detectives began examining properties he owned in other states, including South Carolina and Las Vegas. In South Carolina, investigators searched Hoyerman's property for possible evidence linked to other unsolved cases. Through their thorough examination, officials have removed boxes of potential forensic materials, though they have not disclosed specific findings. Meanwhile, in Las Vegas, cold case detectives have reviewed missing persons reports and homicides, probing the possibility that Hoyerman committed additional crimes while traveling for work or personal reasons. The effort to connect Hoyerman to other crimes remains ongoing. While no additional charges have been filed as of yet, law enforcement across multiple states has taken a renewed interest in cold cases that share similarities with the murders near Gilgo Beach. Whether these efforts turn up hard evidence remains unclear, but the sheer scope of the investigations signals the gravity of Hoyerman's potential crimes. How many lives did his path intertwine with, and how many families could finally gain closure, no matter how bitter. This uncertainty leaves the door open for future developments. If new evidence emerges, prosecutors could bring further charges against Hoyerman. For the families whose loved ones remain unidentified among the Gilgo victims, this provides a slim but important hope that their stories might still find resolution. As one official remarked during the 2023 press briefings, the case remains very active. While prosecutors have focused on securing a conviction in the murders of the Gilgo Four, they continue to track leads on the identities of other victims and investigate how deeply Hoyerman's darkness may have run. Even now, some victims remain nameless, their identities reduced to placeholders like Jane Doe, 3, or Peaches. Their lives, while faded from memory, are far from forgotten. The families of the unidentified victims continue to live in limbo, waiting for the phone call or DNA match that could finally replace unknown with a name. For every breakthrough, there remains a stretch of time where silence weighs heavier than answers. Without definitive connections tying all 10 bodies to one person, the puzzle of who else could be involved lingers like a shadow over the investigation. In many ways, the Long Island serial killer case stands as a stark reminder of the challenges in untangling crimes that span decades. It highlights not just the acts of the predator or predators, but also the systemic failings that allowed these killings to go unchecked for so long. Weaknesses in earlier investigations, combined with less advanced forensic techniques and societal dismissiveness of sex workers, created an environment where a killer could thrive in anonymity. Even now, as modern technology has cracked critical pieces of the puzzle, investigators find themselves racing against an ever-lengthening timeline filled with gaps and uncertainties. Though Rex Hoyerman has been arrested, his guilt in these murders is not yet determined by the courts, and even if a conviction is secured, the case itself may never truly close. The discovery of additional bodies near Gilgo Beach hints at a far broader story, one that may stretch further back, encompass other suspects, or involve unspeakable acts not yet unearthed. Could there still be another, as-yet unseen predator out there? Or do the answers lie solely within Hoyerman's dark double life? For now, we're left with fragments of a still unfinished story. The search for justice remains active, but so do the lingering mysteries. Mysteries that haunt not just the shores of Long Island, but families, communities, and investigators who refuse to let these victims fade into obscurity. This case, far from being resolved, continues to remind us just how many secrets the sands of Gilgo Beach might still hold. The families of the Gilgo Four, the women whose lives were cut short and whose remains were discovered along Gilgo Beach, have endured a long and painful wait for answers. Their grief has been compounded by years of delays, missteps, and the lingering feeling that the system underestimated the urgency of their loved ones' cases. For these families, closure has felt like an elusive promise, always out of reach, yet desperately needed. Missy Can remembers the night her sister Maureen Brainerd Barnes called for the last time. It was late July in 2007, and Maureen, ever the big sister, had been trying to assure Missy that everything was fine. She was calling from a payphone in New York City, from Penn Station to be exact, where she said she was planning to catch the midnight train home, but Maureen never boarded that train, and from that moment on, her voice was silenced. Missy's account of their final conversation highlights the heartbreak of those left behind, a sudden absence punctuated by endless questions. What happened after that call? Who did she meet? Why wasn't there an immediate response to find her? These are the questions that have haunted Missy throughout the years, shaping her efforts to keep Maureen's name in the public eye. For the families, the early years of the investigation were defined by frustration. Law enforcement's initial response to the women's disappearances often reflected dismissive attitudes, rooted in the stigma surrounding their work as escorts. Leads were slow to follow, and many families felt they weren't being taken seriously. This was exacerbated by the scattered jurisdictions from which each woman had gone missing. Megan Waterman disappeared from Long Island, and Melissa Barthélemy vanished from the Bronx, while Maureen Brainerd Barnes was last seen in Manhattan, and Amber Costello disappeared from a nearby Long Island suburb. This fragmentation meant police departments handled their cases separately, not yet realizing they were all connected to a much larger story. While the investigators struggled to piece things together, the families were left in limbo. Time stretched on with few updates, pushing these loved ones into a painful cycle of waiting and wondering. For Mari Gilbert, the mother of Shannon Gilbert, the refusal to accept law enforcement's lack of urgency became a defining battle. Mari refused to stay quiet, attending press conferences, contacting reporters, and publicly challenging local officials to give her daughter's case the attention it deserved. Even when faced with indifference or opposition, she pressed forward, often saying that she wouldn't rest until Shannon's true story was brought to light. Though Shannon's case differed from the Gilgo Four in key ways, the passion and determination Mari brought to her pursuit resonated with other grieving families, inspiring them to raise their voices in the face of extraordinary loss. For Megan Waterman's daughter, Liliana, the loss of her mother carries a different kind of weight. Liliana was only 3 years old when Megan disappeared, meaning she has spent her entire life trying to understand the person her mother was. During a television interview years later, Liliana expressed the thoughts that countless others must have felt, the simple desire to say, "I love you" one more time. Her words, "I never got to really say those words," underline the profound ripple effect loss has on those who, because of age or circumstance, were never given closure. A lifetime of longing, shaped by questions that a child should never have to carry, marks Liliana's journey. The pain of losing a loved one was amplified by the idea that the killer might still be at large. Each passing year felt like another reminder that the system had failed. The families watched helplessly as public attention shifted away from their loved ones, as leads dried up and as hope waned. Yet through this, their voices remained constant, fighting against the tide to ensure the victims weren't forgotten. They spoke at media events, participated in documentaries, and partnered with advocacy groups to shine a renewed light on the case. This collective effort kept the women's stories alive, even when it seemed the investigation was losing ground. Advocacy groups played an essential role during the quiet years of the investigation. Organizations focused on helping families of crime victims worked to highlight the injustices many believed had plagued the handling of the case. They organized vigils, called for task forces, and pushed for transparency in the investigation. In the process, they helped amplify the families' voices while pushing the broader narrative that sex workers, often marginalized and overlooked, deserve the same urgency and care in investigations as any other victim. For Missy Can, her openness about Maureen's life wasn't just an act of grieving, it became an act of defiance. Speaking about her sister's struggles with financial pressures and her decision to become an escort wasn't easy, but Missy believed it was necessary to humanize Maureen in the eyes of an often judgmental public. Whether through interviews or events, Missy ensured that Maureen wasn't reduced to a statistic, explaining that she was a devoted sister and an irreplaceable part of their family. Similarly, Melissa Barthelomew's teenage sister, Amanda, endured unimaginable trauma as the recipient of taunting calls made by the killer. Despite the horror, Amanda remained vocal about Melissa's disappearance, serving as a reminder of just how much the killer's crimes extended beyond the victims themselves, leaving behind an unrelenting aftermath. When Rex Hoyerman was arrested in 2023, it marked a turning point for the victims' families. For over a decade, their lives had been in limbo, filled with unanswered questions and almost no resolution. While the capture of a suspect brought clarity to some aspects of the case, it didn't erase the pain of the years lost or the struggles endured. Families like Maureen's, Megan's, Melissa's, and Amber's now focus their energy on the next stage, the trial. They understand that while the arrest of Hoyerman brought relief, it also marked the beginning of yet another challenging chapter in their efforts to see justice served. The legal process is rarely swift, and the wait for a trial has kept the families in a place of profound uncertainty. The burden grows heavier as details surrounding the crimes emerge, forcing them to relive some of the most painful moments of their lives. Still, their determination to honor their loved ones remains constant. This strength has been their unifying trait through years of accusation, delay, and uncertainty. Even with the potential for legal resolution, it's clear that justice won't bring these women back, nor will it truly close the gaping hole left in their families' lives. What it will do, however, is offer recognition of the lives they lived, the struggles they faced, and the unimaginable cruelty they suffered. Recognition that they mattered. The family's fight for justice hasn't just been about their own loved ones. It has also been about advocating for systemic change, calling attention to how investigations often overlook or deprioritize victims who come from marginalized backgrounds. They've reminded the public and law enforcement alike that every life has value, regardless of circumstance, and that every family deserves answers, no matter the obstacles. While the spotlight now shines on Hoyerman and the details of his alleged crimes, the families remain steadfast in reminding the world of what truly matters. The women whose lives were stolen, who were mothers, sisters, daughters, and friends. Those whose names might have been forgotten without the tireless work of those who loved them. For these families, the fight isn't over. It won't be over until justice is fully served, until every victim is identified, and until every question has an answer. While the process will undoubtedly stretch on into the future, one thing is certain: they will never stop fighting. Their perseverance has ensured that their loved ones' stories remain heard, and that silence will never again settle over the sands of Gilgo Beach. The Long Island serial killer case did more than shock a community. It called into question how society approaches the pursuit of justice for victims from vulnerable populations and revealed the systemic blind spots that allowed a killer or killers to evade capture for so long. The lessons learned from this investigation stretch far beyond the beaches of Long Island. This case has left behind critical questions about policing, technology, and the way victims are treated in the legal system, all while reinforcing just how fragile the processes meant to protect individuals can be. The investigation into the Gilgo Beach murders became a study in the ripple effects of prioritization, or rather, a lack thereof. At the time the victims first began disappearing, their cases were handled with a disjointed urgency at best. Each woman's disappearance was seen as isolated and unconnected to the others, perhaps because their work as online escorts made them easy for some to dismiss as transient or inherently at risk. This tendency to deprioritize crimes involving sex workers remains one of the darkest themes of the case. Too often, law enforcement agencies rely on stereotypes when making decisions about which cases receive critical resources early on. The need for more equitable treatment and protection for marginalized communities within the criminal justice system has lingered at the heart of discussions surrounding Gilgo Beach. Many believe that had the victims fallen into a different demographic, the authorities might have acted sooner, shortening the killer's spree or saving lives. Beyond the victims' work or backgrounds, the fragmented nature of the resources used to investigate the disappearances raised additional challenges. With reports originating in vastly different jurisdictions, New York City, Maine, Connecticut, there was little collaboration at the start. Early coordination failures between police precincts allowed critical patterns to go unnoticed until it was too late to intervene. It was only after the discovery of remains along Gilgo Beach that agencies began working together, but the years of delay leading up to that point exposed flaws in communication and resource sharing, not just at the local or state level, but across federal lines as well. The eventual involvement of the FBI, particularly in analyzing phone records and helping identify technology-based evidence, highlighted how crucial cross-jurisdictional collaboration can be, especially where serial crimes or cold cases are concerned. The significance of modern forensic technology cannot be overstated in this case. The breakthroughs that ultimately connected Rex Heuermann to the murders depended on advancements that weren't available when the first bodies were discovered. Forensic science had evolved considerably in the years since 2010. The hair recovered from the burlap wrap near Megan Waterman's body sat dormant in evidence lockers for years, powerless to lead investigators to a suspect. But with improvements in mitochondrial DNA analysis, it became possible to match that sample to Heuermann in 2023, bringing perhaps the most damning evidence to the forefront. Similarly, the use of a discarded pizza crust to confirm a DNA link underscores the importance of such techniques in ensuring cold cases are not forgotten. It's moments like these that remind investigators and the public how critical investment in forensic science truly is. Without it, many long unsolved cases would remain locked in the past. Technology also played a central role in tracing Heuermann's digital activities. The killer's use of burner phones had once seemed like an unbreakable shield, frustrating investigators who lacked the tools to track these devices in real time. Years later, advancements in cell tower data analysis enabled authorities to re-examine the information, pinpointing connections between the burner phones and the Massapequa Park area where Heuermann lived. This breakthrough turned what had once been a dead end into a major lead, ultimately tightening the net around the suspect. Yet, the investigation also revealed a deeper challenge, balancing the benefits of technological access with privacy concerns. Burner phones remain a grey area in law enforcement, with debates ongoing about how these tools might be regulated in the future to aid similar investigations while respecting individual rights. The societal implications of the Long Island case extend beyond the forensic or technological. It forced many to confront uncomfortable truths about how vulnerable populations are treated by the justice system and by society as a whole. The stigma surrounding the victim's profession didn't just hinder public perception. In some cases, it slowed the very process of searching for them. Missing person reports for sex workers are too often overlooked or treated as lower priority cases, particularly when adults are involved. This perception of lifestyle risk creates a bias that can leave sex workers and other marginalized groups, especially vulnerable to violent crime. In response to such issues, victim advocacy groups have pushed for more nuanced investigations that avoid moral judgment while focusing on the human lives at stake. The Long Island case serves as a stark reminder of how dangerous it can be to allow societal biases to creep into criminal investigations. Another valuable takeaway is the critical role victim advocacy and community voices can play in keeping a case alive. During the years when the investigation stagnated, it was the victims' families and evolving media coverage that kept the case in the public eye. Families of the Gilgo Four, in particular, refused to let their loved ones disappear without a fight, maintaining pressure on law enforcement by keeping their stories visible. The families worked with advocacy groups to raise awareness around the lack of urgency in the earlier stages of the investigation. This persistence paid off in 2022 with the formation of a new task force, bringing fresh eyes to the case and reigniting traction toward justice. It's a powerful reminder that when systems falter, communities and especially families have the ability to push for accountability and results. The Long Island serial killer case also demonstrates the importance of understanding how predators exploit new tools. In this instance, the killer's use of online platforms to locate, contact, and lure victims underscores the dangers such technologies can enable. Craigslist, a platform once unregulated and widely used for escort advertisements, provided anonymity that worked in the killer's favor. Situations like these have sparked wider conversations about improving safety in online environments, especially for users working in high-risk industries. While policymakers tread carefully to avoid infringing on legitimate uses of such platforms, the need for safeguards remains a growing focus area for public safety advocates. At its core, this case raises one of the most uncomfortable questions. Have we learned enough to prevent something like this from happening again? The advancements in technology and collaboration that ultimately led to a suspect's arrest are undeniably encouraging, but they don't guarantee a foolproof system going forward. Serial crimes, by their nature, exploit systemic vulnerabilities. If more emphasis isn't placed on early red flags, disappearances that might seem isolated at first but point to a larger pattern, it's all too easy for dangerous individuals to operate undisturbed. In reflecting on this case, officers, policymakers, and advocates alike continue to weigh what still needs to change in the years ahead. Finally, this case underscores the need to support not only investigations but the recovery of those left behind. The trauma faced by the victims' families is a crucial, often overlooked part of the story. Groups that offer advocacy, counseling, and restorative services to grieving loved ones have reported the far-reaching impact of such violent crimes. The families of the victims have faced immense emotional and psychological trauma, as noted, and this case brought to light the ongoing need for more robust services to meet those needs. Public awareness campaigns fueled by the case have also shone a spotlight on these challenges, emphasizing the importance of funding for grief support and victim advocacy organizations. When we look back at the Long Island case, it serves as much more than a chapter in true crime history. It's a cautionary tale about the cost of oversight, the power of persistence, and the fragility of protections for the most vulnerable. For those involved, there are no neat conclusions, but every advancement in the case, even one as long delayed as the eventual arrest of Rex Hoyerman, underscores the importance of collective effort. From families refusing to give up, to scientists applying cutting-edge tools to uncover hidden truths, these efforts serve as a reminder that while justice may be slow, it's no less critical for the victims whose stories demand to be told. And for future cases yet to come, this legacy carries an urgent message. No victim should ever be dismissed, no matter their circumstances, and no case should ever rest while questions remain unanswered. The Long Island serial killer case stands as a stark reminder of the importance of persistence. Early missteps and the marginalization of vulnerable victims, like the Gilgo Four, stalled progress for years. But the tireless determination of families, advocacy groups, and investigators ensured the search for justice endured. The need for more equitable treatment and protection for marginalized communities within the criminal justice system remains clear even now. This case highlights the power of renewed effort and evolving technology, offering hope for other unsolved cases. Stay informed, share these stories, and support initiatives that amplify the voices of the forgotten. Welcome back again. Tonight we will cover a shocking true crime case from Germany with a lot of bizarre twists. Before we start, please like this video and comment down below what time it is wherever you are right now. Let's get to it. 6 months before the Hinterkaifeck murders, the family's maid suddenly quit, claiming the farm was haunted. Weeks later, Andreas Gruber found footprints in fresh snow that led directly to his home, but none leaving it. And then there was the strange newspaper from Munich he swore he never bought. These were the first ripples of something far darker. On March 31, 1922, a new maid arrived. By the next day, every person on the farm would be dead. What happened in those hours remains one of Germany's most unsettling riddles. It started with something small enough to wave away. Andreas Gruber noticed a newspaper from Munich lying in his home. It wasn't the sudden arrival of a letter or a strange item of value, but an ordinary paper. The problem was, he hadn't bought it, and no one else in his family claimed they had either. On any other farm closer to town, this might have been explained easily. Perhaps a neighbour dropped it off by mistake, or a visitor left it behind. But Hinterkaifeck was not like other farms. It stood alone, a half-mile from the nearest house, and surrounded by thick woods on one side and open fields on the other. The path that led there didn't see casual travellers. Strangers appeared only when they had business. In March 1922, life in rural Bavaria moved slowly, especially for families that farmed their own land. Deliveries or visitors were rare enough to be memorable. For that reason, finding a city newspaper that belonged to no one in the household was not just unexpected, it was strange. The home was days removed from Munich, and they had no regular reason to receive periodicals from there. Newspapers were paid for and delivered on schedule, not randomly. That meant someone had carried it onto the property. Andreas asked his wife, Cecilia, and his daughter, Victoria, if they had bought it or received it from a friend. Both said no. He asked again a day later. The answer was the same. At some point he mentioned it to a neighbour, hoping they might say they had stopped by and left it. None had. The newspaper remained without an origin, and there was no one else to ask. With only a few farms scattered in the area, each resident knew who passed through and why. Mail carriers could be accounted for. Regular tradesmen were trusted. No one could recall bringing a Munich newspaper to Hinterkaifeck. It was a loose end that would have been easy to brush away in a busier place, but here, in the stillness of the countryside, it carried weight. The question was whether this was simply an accident or the work of someone making a deliberate choice. Was it possible it had been dropped by a traveller cutting across the land? Almost no one had reason to take that route, especially in early spring, when the ground was still soft and muddy in patches. If someone had walked all the way up, they would have been seen or left signs of their visit. The idea that it might have been intentional nagged at him. If it was, then the motive for leaving it could be more than just kindness or carelessness. Even without knowing the term, it might match what's now called a test intrusion. It's a small, low-risk way for someone to confirm whether a person notices an outside presence. Criminals or stalkers sometimes use minor disruptions, moving an object, leaving something behind, or creating a subtle disturbance to see how their target reacts. If the homeowner responds strongly, the attempt might be abandoned. If they seem not to notice or don't act on it, the intruder may feel bolder. Andreas brought the newspaper inside and kept it. Whether that was out of curiosity or because he thought it might still be useful isn't clear, but he did not involve the police. In the rural culture of the time, involving law enforcement over something so minor risked ridicule. The expectation was to solve small mysteries privately, or to let them drop. He may have also considered that reporting it would require travel, time away from the farm, and an admission that he had no clue how it appeared. As the days passed, he seemed to accept the lack of an answer. The absence of other signs, no missing items, no broken locks, no scattered possessions, made it easier to file the incident away. The newspaper sat as a harmless but unexplained object, no longer a point of daily discussion. In hindsight, it stood out because of everything that would follow, but at the moment, it was a small irregularity in an otherwise ordered life. On farms like Hinterkaifeck, routines were tight, animals were tended at specific times, tools returned to their places, and family members accounted for. The unexpected was rare enough to matter, yet even then, human nature leans toward assuming innocence over malice when there's little evidence to the contrary. Still, a single, unexplained detail can be a warning that's only recognized later. In this case, the warning might have been that someone knew the family's habits well enough to come onto the property undetected. In a community where every visit was noticed, that suggested familiarity and patience. Whoever left the paper wouldn't have had to force a way in. They could walk up the long track, stay hidden until the right moment, enter or approach quietly, and leave something in plain sight. The fact that no one saw or heard them meant they understood the rhythms of the people living there. In modern cases, where similar patterns occur, investigators sometimes describe finding evidence showing an intruder had been close, but not yet committed the crime. Sometimes they find items moved in sheds, padlocks tampered with but left closed, or harmless objects, like notes or newspapers, left where the homeowner can see them. The behavior is cautious, almost experimental. Had Andreas taken the newspaper as more than an annoyance, or at least told more of the neighbouring farmers, there might have been a collective decision to keep watch or to note unfamiliar faces in the area. A single family could be watched without them knowing, but watching a whole rural community unnoticed was far harder. Instead, the incident remained private, known only within the household. and possibly one or two neighbors who could offer no answers. That privacy may have been intentional. In small villages, spreading word about a puzzling event could start rumors. Not all attention would be helpful, especially for a family already carrying whispers about their personal lives. The Grubers had their reasons for wanting to limit talk about what happened on their land. Maintaining control over information gave them the final say on what was important and what wasn't. It's also possible pride played a part. A man of Andreas's generation was expected to protect his household without needing outside help. Admitting a stranger had approached without his knowledge might be too close to admitting weakness. Discretion in such matters was often seen as a form of strength, even if it left questions unanswered. If the paper was a test, the result would have told the person responsible exactly what they wanted to know, that they could enter the property, leave something, and face no immediate consequences. The family didn't change their routines in response. They didn't call for extra help, or patrols, or keep watch at night. Nothing about life on the farm shifted in the wake of the discovery. That stability, so important to the smooth running of the place, might have also been reassuring to anyone watching from outside. Over time, the unusualness of finding a Munich paper in the middle of an isolated Bavarian farm would fade in memory. But human memory also has a way of sharpening old moments when later events give them new meaning. In the week before the crime, several smaller incidents were recalled by those still alive to speak about them. The newspaper became the first in that chain, not because it was the most threatening, but because it was the earliest sign at which a choice could have been made to respond differently. When viewed on its own, it could have been a curiosity at best, the kind of thing that calls up short-lived conversation at the family table. But history shows it as a marker, the point where the trail begins to darken. At the time, no one at Hinterkaifeck treated it as a call to action, and so it became a footnote, until the events that followed brought it into sharp focus as the first visible ripple of something much larger. That larger pattern didn't take long to grow. Within weeks, other signs of intrusion began to surface. None were as harmless-looking as a newspaper left on a table, and each would press harder against the boundary between a private farm and the world beyond it. As the family kept their worries close, the quiet isolation that made the place feel safe would begin to change, and with it, so would the sense of control they thought they had over their own land. It was still cold enough for snow to lie across the fields when Andreas Gruber saw them. A line of clear footprints stretched across the white crust from the edge of the woods to the farmhouse. Each step pressed deep and sharp, showing the tread of heavy boots. They ended at the door, and then stopped. There were no imprints leading away, no signs of someone circling back. The only tracks visible were the ones that came in. Winter at Hinterkaifeck was quiet. With no other farms in close sight, snow stayed untouched for days, unless the family or their animals disturbed it. Anyone walking toward the house would stand out plainly. Fresh snow was like a record of movement, and here that record told a troubling story. Someone had walked all the way up, but never appeared to leave. The conditions made it hard to imagine a reasonable explanation. This was not melting spring slush where marks could blur. The snow was firm, and light had not yet softened it. To erase the return path would have taken deliberate effort, like stepping in exactly the same prints or covering them. The way the trail ended so cleanly at the threshold suggested neither wind nor accident. For Andreas, it was another puzzle to add to what had already been sitting in his mind. In that same period, he noticed the front door lock had been broken. It was a heavy, well-worn lock that had endured years of use, but now it hung out of alignment. It could still catch if pulled just right, but it no longer felt solid. The broken lock and the unexplained tracks made for a strange combination. One could be dismissed as weather damage or age, the other as a traveller passing by. Together, they hinted at someone not only reaching the farm, but trying to get inside, or at least testing how secure the entrance was. In a city, an unlocked door might not stand out as dangerous. On an isolated farm, it could mean that the barrier between inside and out was one shove from giving way. Andreas spoke about the footprints to a few neighbours over the next day or so. In a close rural community, such news travelled quickly between farmsteads. Visiting each other was part of life, and so was sharing concerns about strangers in the area. Some neighbours offered to come by after dark to keep an eye out, or to help mend the lock. They did not treat his story lightly. In the early 1920s, theft from remote farms was not unheard of, and a bold intruder could do serious harm before anyone could respond. Help was a natural thing to offer, but Andreas turned it down. He said he could manage the matter himself. Whatever his reasons, they ended the conversation there. No formal warning went out to others along the road, and no one arranged a watch on the property. Even for those who suspected the situation might be more serious, Pressing the matter was not the way things were done. A man's word that he had it in hand was often the final word. His refusal could have been shaped by many things. Pride was one, as head of the household. Admitting he could not secure his own home might be seen as weakness. Privacy was another. The Gruber family's personal life already drew whispers in the hamlet, and more visitors poking around might feed them. Fear may have played a part too. If the person who left those tracks was still nearby, facing them could risk more than a missing lock. There was also the possibility he simply did not believe the threat was real. Without direct confrontation, the idea of someone watching from the trees might seem too unlikely to warrant altering the daily routine. What would stand out later was not just the existence of the footprints, but the fact that they were ignored. In hindsight, they looked like an early sign of an intruder mapping the approach to the house. This is something investigators in modern cases note. Persons intending to break in sometimes test routes and timing before acting, making approaches to see if anyone notices. A trail in came without one going back might mean the person entered and stayed, slipping out hours later under the cover of night or through another path. If so, they could have been close enough to watch the family without being seen. At the time, though, with work to be done and animals to tend, life pressed on. A farm in late winter still demanded constant effort. Skipping chores or changing patterns over what could be dismissed as an odd track was not easy to justify, especially when each day brought tasks that could not be postponed. That thinking made sense to people who measured danger by immediate harm. Without clear evidence of theft or violence, the risk felt distant. The reality of rural Bavaria then was that homes were often left unlatched or with only simple locks. Trust in one's surroundings was high, and the space between neighbours meant not every approach to a house was seen. Even so, the prince bothered Andreas enough to mention them, and for others to recall his account later. But they did not prompt a safeguard or a search. Those who heard about the tracks before the murders would remember later how clear Andreas was about them stopping at the building. The image of boots cutting straight to the door but nowhere else took on a sinister shape after the killings. In reconstructing events, investigators would see it as evidence that someone familiar with the farm had been scouting it. With no return path to show, the most logical reading was that they had found shelter there, at least for hours. The broken lock's role is harder to pinpoint. Whether it was forced during that approach or had already been weakened, its failure would mean easier entry. If the killer had tried the door then, they might have learned just how simply they could step through later. Combined with the lack of immediate action from the family, it could have encouraged a second visit, one that would not end with only footprints in the snow. Small rural crimes then often followed a similar pattern. Visible signs that went unchallenged, followed by bolder acts. Without police called in early, because travel took time or the incident seemed minor, those acts could escalate without warning. For Hinterkaifeck, the escalation would come quietly. The prints in the snow were the sort of clue that only felt urgent once the outcome was known. By keeping the matter private, Andreas limited the number of eyes watching over the property. Neighbours could not help notice someone lurking if they did not know what to look for. That choice preserved privacy, but also left space for any intruder to move freely. From the outside, no sign showed that the family felt unsafe. Daily routines stayed visible, tending animals, moving between barn and house, crossing the yard. That steadiness, under most conditions a strength, could also tell a hidden watcher that nothing had changed from their first visit. It is possible Andreas believed that simply locking up more carefully would be enough, or that whoever came had already taken what they wanted. Either way, the farm did not see extra protection after the tracks. No neighbour was asked to stay the night. No tools moved near the house for defence. On paper, the incident ended as soon as the old prints were covered by new snow. Yet after the murders, that line of steps frozen in white became one of the most telling prelude scenes. Investigators piecing together the timeline could point to it as one of several events, showing someone approaching the family before the attack. Each of these moments could be seen as probes, quiet, limited actions to learn about the household. First a newspaper appearing without cause, then the solitary track stopping at the door. Both carried the message that an unseen presence had reached the farm without being confronted. The neighbours' offers of aid, turned away without much debate, became the missed chance to build a wall of awareness around the Grubers. In small communities, word about suspicious movement could make strangers stand out sharply. But that chance passed, and isolation kept the family on their usual path. No extra eyes, no disruption to the watcher's comfort. This refusal of help and the decision to keep possible dangers unspoken would mark the next weeks. Even as new worries arose, they would stay contained within the farmyard, and with each unchallenged sign, the space between feeling safe and being safe became harder to see. 6 months before the murders, The family's maid made a decision that surprised everyone who knew her. She had been with the Grubers for some time, long enough to know their habits and the rhythm of life on the farm. Work was steady, the pay was certain, and positions like hers were not easy to come by in rural Bavaria during the early 1920s. Yet she quit suddenly, and the reason she gave was that she believed the farmhouse was haunted. By then, she had seen enough of the property to understand that its location meant it was quiet, often without visitors for days. But she told people the quiet was not what troubled her. It was the noises, sounds she could not explain, especially coming from the attic. She said she heard footsteps above when everyone she knew was downstairs. Sometimes it was the creaking of the floorboards overhead. Other times it was faint but deliberate movement, as if someone was pacing. The attic was only used for storage, and there was no good reason for anyone to be up there at night. Yet the sounds persisted. The sense of being watched bothered her even more. She began to feel it while doing ordinary work, like hanging laundry in the yard or cleaning in the kitchen. The feeling was strongest when she was alone, and although she never saw anyone, she described it as if eyes were on her from somewhere just out of sight. In a farmhouse surrounded by open land, that feeling did not fade when the workday ended. It followed her into the evening and into her sleeping hours. Rural Bavaria, at the time, was a place where belief in the supernatural was common. Stories about spirits, haunted places, or bad omens were shared without much hesitation. A claim of haunting might not have been dismissed in the way it would be in a city. For the maid, those beliefs shaped how she interpreted what she was experiencing. Strange noises in the attic, the constant sense of being watched, these were part of her reason for thinking the place itself was not right. She stayed for a while, perhaps trying to adapt, but over time the decision to leave formed. Economic reality made that choice unusual. It was not a time when people quit stable work without a plan. Many domestic workers relied on those positions to support themselves and, often, to send money to family members. Leaving without another job lined up could mean weeks or months of hardship. That she made this choice shows how seriously the unease had taken hold. When she left, the Gruber household lost not just a worker, but a pair of hands that lightened the load. Life on a farm meant long hours of labor from early morning until after dark. Household work and outdoor work both needed attention, and without the maid, more of that burden fell on the family itself. Cecilia took on more household duties. Victoria helped with both chores and farming work, and Andreas balanced his time between tending to the animals, managing the fields, and keeping the property in order. Losing a worker was a setback, especially in the lead up to winter. Her departure was mentioned later during the investigation into the murders. It stood out because it was one of the first pieces of information in which an outsider had expressed clear discomfort about the property. Other events, like the newspaper or the footprints, were kept mostly within the family or shared only with a few neighbors. This was different. The maid told people in plain terms that she did not want to stay there. Her reason, haunting, might not have been the language investigators would use, but it meant she believed the place was unsafe for reasons she could not fully explain. Later speculation suggested she might have sensed something more tangible than a haunting. Some who have studied the case have wondered if the noises she described could have been a person hiding in the attic. The idea is not without precedent. In other crimes, intruders have been found to live secretly in parts of houses for days or weeks, moving around quietly to avoid detection. From her point of view, she did not have proof of an intruder, only the repeated experience of hearing movements when no family member was in that part of the building. It is difficult to say whether the Grubers believed her account or thought it was imagination. In close-knit rural communities, accusations of a haunted house could bring unwanted attention. Superstition was common, but farming families often faced a clash between such beliefs and practical concerns. A belief in spirits might lead some to avoid a place, but publicly admitting fear like that could lead others to dismiss you as unreliable. If Andreas or Cecilia feared that talking about strange noises would invite gossip about the property, they may have chosen to downplay the maid's claims. Her absence also had a subtle effect on the family's self-sufficiency. With fewer people to split the labor, they spent more time on routine tasks, leaving less energy for maintaining security or noticing small changes in their surroundings. The additional workload could mean doors were locked less regularly if hands were busy elsewhere, or that animals were tended before daylight or after dark when visibility was low. In these conditions, an outsider trying to get close to the farm would face fewer moments when someone was free to watch the yard closely. From a modern viewpoint, her departure is a clear marker. It was the first human voice to say that living there had become intolerable. Unlike objects left behind or footprints, which require interpretation, her leaving was an action, taken despite the cost to herself, that pointed to something wrong. Investigators could only guess, however, whether what she felt was linked to the later murders. Without knowing exactly what caused the noises or the feeling she described, it remained a piece of the puzzle but not one that could be confirmed. The timing of her decision is also worth noting. 6 months is a long gap before the crime, and yet it is close enough that the conditions she faced could have had some connection to the events that followed. If there was an intruder or someone watching the farm at that earlier date, they may have been studying the family for months before acting. If that is the case, the maid's experiences would have been an early symptom of a much longer plan. In a case where so little is certain, her story adds to the outline of unease that seemed to build in stages. First, a worker inside the home leaves because the environment feels threatening. Then, over the next months, strange signs appear outside. Objects where they should not be, tracks leading in but not out, locks damaged. Each step might have felt isolated to those living there, but from the outside, it forms a chain. The family did eventually hire another maid, but there was a long stretch without one. In that time, they adapted to working without extra help. That meant whoever joined them next would be coming into a household with a lot of responsibility resting on each person's shoulders. The replacement would also be stepping into a property with a recent history of odd disturbances, and in her case, into the very end of that story. The departure 6 months earlier had removed one witness from the household, someone who could have noticed and spoken about more of the strange activity. By the time the position was filled again, the tension on the farm had shifted into its final phase. The new maid, Maria Baumgartner, would arrive under circumstances that neither she nor the family could know were already set against them. She would not have the same months of warning the previous maid had felt. For her, the beginning and the end would come on the same day. Despite the strange events around the farm, Andreas Gruber did not want extra eyes watching over his land. In the months leading up to the murders, neighbors noticed his reluctance to accept help that, in most situations, would have been taken for granted. He had already spoken to some of them about the footprints in the snow and the broken door lock. These were not small details in a place where people knew who belonged and who did not. Yet when men from nearby homes offered to stay the night or check the property at odd hours, he turned them down. The surrounding community was typical of rural Bavaria at the time. Families ran their farms with the understanding that neighbors would assist each other when needed. That applied to harvests, livestock trouble, bad weather, or any sign of suspicious activity. Distance between houses meant that it might take a while for someone to reach you, but once word spread, help followed. People often left tools in shared sheds or checked on each other's property if they were passing by. In that culture, refusing assistance was unusual, especially after mentioning concerns that someone might have been on your land uninvited. Gruber's refusals stood out because they went against the unspoken rules of the hamlet. You might guard your privacy on personal matters, but when it came to a possible threat, it was common sense to involve others. The offers to guard or investigate were practical. One neighbor remembered suggesting they could keep watch in the nights for a while to see if the stranger came back. The suggestion cost nothing but time. It did not risk public scandal, but Andreas chose to keep all responsibility within his household. The reasons for his stance were never put in writing. Those who knew him said he was a proud man, capable of managing his own affairs. Pride alone, though, might not explain the pattern. There was also the matter of the family's reputation. Rumours about Andreas and his daughter Victoria had circulated in the area before. The documented fact of their incestuous relationship had led to legal trouble years earlier. While people might still work alongside the Grubers in daily matters, the scandal remained part of their reputation. Allowing outsiders to linger at the farm could revive the talk or invite more attention to the family's private life. Mistrust could have factored in as well. In small agricultural communities, disputes over boundaries, livestock, and debts were common. Even among neighbours you greeted daily, there could be quiet grudges. If Andreas suspected that someone nearby might be involved in the disturbances, even indirectly, he would be unlikely to invite them into the heart of his property after dark. Declining offers avoided the need to share details he was not prepared to discuss. Fear is another possibility. For all his firmness with others, living with a sense that someone might be watching the farm could have made him cautious about involving anyone who might become a target. In that way, handling it alone may have felt safer, even if it actually left the family more vulnerable. Without knowing exactly who left the newspaper, made the footprints, or handled the lock, he may have believed that keeping quiet was a defense of its own. Whatever the reason, those decisions meant that no outsider kept watch over the farm at night. Opportunities to patrol, to spot an unfamiliar figure near the barn, were lost. In hindsight, each refused offer looks like a moment when someone might have noticed movements or heard sounds that the family did not. An intruder who knew the area could see that no extra help had arrived, no lights burned later than usual, and no dogs from other farms were being walked near the property to disturb the quiet. They could plan without interference. The refusal to involve the local authority also meant no official record was made of the earlier events. The police never heard about the strange newspaper, the footprints that stopped at the door, or the broken lock until after the murders. In a small district like that, word from the police to watch for strangers would have spread quickly. Without it, the intruders' movements went unnoticed beyond Hinterkaifeck itself. Some neighbors later questioned whether Andreas knew more than he had ever told them. That was speculation, but it grew from the way he balanced acknowledgement of the strange events with a clear unwillingness to act on them publicly. If he had a private suspicion, whether about a specific person or a hidden cause, he did not share it. For the investigators who pieced together the timeline, that gap became part of the mystery. They could not tell if his silence had been protective, stubborn, or based on information he refused to reveal. Refusals alone do not cause a crime, but they shape the conditions before it happens. Here, they meant the intruder had weeks, maybe months, without increased risk of discovery. In remote areas, even one extra person watching could drastically cut down on opportunities for someone to approach unseen. Without that, approaches to the barn or house could be tested at different times of day, and paths in and out could be learned without anyone intervening. Looking back from modern policing standards, the pattern is stark. Now, when small rural properties report unexplained entries or damage, police often encourage immediate sharing of details with the community. Even if there is not enough evidence for a charge, the extra awareness makes intrusion harder. In the 1920s, Community Watch worked only if the homeowner opened the door to it. In this case, that door stayed closed. It is also worth noting that in that era, the lines between home, farm, and field were more open than today. Boundaries were not always fenced, or if they were, they might be easy to cross. Larger livestock fields were shared spaces at certain times of year. Visitors or workers from outside the family could come onto the property without every step being noticed, and if no one had been told to watch for suspicious behavior, they would pass without a word. Without a signal from Andreas that the household was on alert, the people nearby would see nothing out of the ordinary. His refusal of aid also reinforces how isolated the family was, beyond the physical distance from other homes. It was a social isolation created by choice in some ways, and possibly by the lingering effects of scandal in others. In a place where much of life depended on trust and exchange, breaking that pattern effectively narrowed the circle of people with a reason to check in on you unasked. That left only close family in the loop, and in this case, close family meant the same 4 adults who would soon be among the victims. The offers of help were simple: an extra set of eyes, occasional nights spent on the property, repairs to the lock. Declining them left the family to manage risk within their own resources. That might have been enough in ordinary times, but if the disturbances were the work of someone preparing for a bigger act, it meant their work went ahead without disruption. The intruder already knew how far the farm was from neighbors. Learning that no one else would be moving in and out was likely one more confirmation that the farm could be approached on the intruder's terms. Every community has its own ways of managing danger. In Hinterkaifeck, the standard was mutual surveillance through regular interaction. Neighbors noticed who passed by, noted wagons or figures in the fields where they did not belong, and made mental lists of when a family was away. By shutting out those habits, Andreas took on full responsibility for identifying and deterring threats. That choice, whether made out of pride, mistrust, privacy, or fear, meant that no one outside the family could say what happened on the property in the days before the murders. To the investigators, that meant key opportunities were gone before they even began. The small moments when someone might have been spotted, a cart might have been traced, or tracks might have been followed, simply never occurred. The isolation was not just a feature of the farm's location. It was a result of deliberate decisions about who got to see inside the circle of trust. Those decisions could not be undone once the crime happened, but they shaped the path the case would take. At the heart of it, the refusals were part of the steady background to life at Hinterkaifeck during that winter and early spring. The family experienced unusual events but held them close, dealing with them on their own terms. To people outside, nothing seemed urgent enough to push past the family's wishes. And so the weeks passed, the ground thawed, and life on the farm continued its same patterns until the day a new maid arrived, stepping into those patterns just as they were about to be broken forever. On the afternoon of March 31, 1922, Maria Baumgartner arrived at Hinterkaifeck. She had travelled with her sister, who had agreed to escort her to the farm. After helping her settle in, her sister left, making her one of the last people outside the family to see them alive. The visit was not intended to be noteworthy. Maria had come to start a new job, one that would provide her with work and a place to live. She was stepping into a household she did not know well, and as far as anyone can tell, she had no awareness that this job would end before it had truly begun. There is little recorded about Maria's life before she came to Hinterkaifeck. Many domestic workers in rural Bavaria at the time came from nearby towns or villages, often sent by family or finding work through acquaintances. The work was steady but demanding. Duties could range from preparing meals and cleaning to helping with light farm tasks if needed. For some, the room and board arrangements made these jobs more appealing than seasonal labor or factory work, especially in smaller communities. Maria's placement at Hinterkaifeck followed the usual pattern. She would live in the house, take her meals with the family, and be on hand for both household and occasional farm help. Maria could not have known that this isolated property had been the site of months of strange and unexplained activity. Andreas Gruber had not shared the details of the odd newspaper that appeared in the home, the footprints that came only toward the house in the snow, or the broken lock on the front door. The earlier maid's departure after hearing noises in the attic was also a matter kept within a small circle. From Maria's perspective, she was coming into a new role in a quiet, rural homestead. The Grubers had work for her, a room ready upstairs, and there was no sign that she should expect anything unusual. Her journey to the farm likely started earlier that day in a nearby town. The exact train schedules are not preserved, but it would have been common to travel by local rail, or a combination of rail and cart, to reach a place like Hinterkaifeck. The last part of the trip was by foot or wagon, along the track that led from the hamlet to the isolated farmhouse. There were open fields on either side, and a stretch of woods in the distance. Like others seeing the farm for the first time, Maria would have noticed the wide yard, the well-built barn connected to the living quarters, and the house's simple two-story design. Her sister saw her to the door. Inside, Maria met the family she would be working for, Andreas and Cecilia Gruber, their adult daughter Victoria, and her two children, also named Cecilia and Joseph. The routine would have been explained briefly, including meals at certain times, assigned chores, and the expectations for her first days. Whether the Grubers mentioned that they had been without a maid for months is not recorded, but they must have recognized some relief in having help again. Maria took her things to the upstairs room where she would be sleeping. This was a private space, possibly furnished with a small bed, a table, and a washstand. Attic rooms in rural homes were often cold in late March, with the lingering chill of winter still in the air, but they were separate from the main family bedrooms. From her window, she may have seen part of the yard and the fields beyond. Looking inside at this stage, there was no visible hint of the unease that had been slowly building on the property for months. While Maria unpacked and settled into her room, the family went about their daily late afternoon routines. Animals needed feeding in the barn, and the evening meal had to be prepared. The farm would have been busy, but not frantic. Spring work was beginning, but this was not the peak of harvest. For Maria, the pace and setting were likely exactly what she expected from a job description: a working farm with a need for steady upkeep, and a household that relied on regular, coordinated effort. The timing of her arrival placed her directly in the path of what was about to happen. She had stepped into the story when the series of small, unexplained events was about to reach its conclusion. To her, this was simply her first day of employment. To investigators looking back, this was the moment the last person entered the house before the killings took place. She was the final change in the household before the attack. There is no evidence to suggest she was uneasy or suspicious during those hours. The afternoon passed in ordinary tasks, such as meeting the family, putting belongings in place, and perhaps lending a hand in the kitchen. Conversations would have been about schedules, routines, and what was expected. No one stopped to tell her that 2 nights earlier Andreas had turned down offers from neighbors to stay on the property, or that throughout the winter there had been incidents no one could explain. Her sister's departure left Maria in the company of the Grubers alone. That shift from the outside world to the closed environment of the farm was a natural part of domestic service, and Maria had no way to know she was also stepping into the final hours of everyone's lives. The isolation that might have felt peaceful to someone unfamiliar with the warnings would, to those aware of the situation, also mean that any danger approaching the farm would have no rival for miles. At that time of year, daylight faded early. As the sun dropped, animals were secured for the night, and doors latched against the cool air. Lamps or candles inside provided a small circle of light in each room, leaving the outer edges of the yard dark. Maria's upstairs room, being away from the busiest part of the house, would have been a quiet place early in the evening. From there, she might have heard the muted movement of the family below, the low noises from the barn as animals settled, or the wind passing outside. Those simple sensory details were part of what made the hours appear uneventful in the moment. It is only in the context of the crime that this calmness feels like the surface stillness before something irreversible. The caretaker's presence in her room was as normal as Andreas moving between the house and barn, or Victoria readying her children for bed. Everything seemed routine, right up until the moment it was not. The important thing about this point in the timeline is that Maria arrived during the last stage of a long, hidden progression. She had not been there for the newspaper left without explanation, for the footprints that came to the house but not away, or for the broken lock. She had not seen the prior maid's discomfort. She had no background to connect those dots, and no reason to take special caution. That made her, without knowing it, as vulnerable as the rest. Her arrival also shows how quickly circumstances can shift from ordinary to extraordinary. Hours earlier, Maria and her sister were moving through the countryside, focused on getting her to her new position. Hours later, dusk would settle over the farm, with everyone inside unaware that it was their last evening. The barn and house would appear unchanged from the outside, and there would be no immediate sign to anyone passing by that danger had closed in. In the decades since, this sequence of Maria stepping into the household, the quiet afternoon, and the settling into her room has been seen as the final addition to a pattern that had been building for months. The moment marked the end of any opportunity for the household to prepare or change course. If earlier signs had been the beginning of a threat taking shape, her arrival was the point at which the plan, whatever it was already in place. Whatever happened next was going to happen with her inside the farm. Maria Baumgartner's first day was also her last. In that quiet window between afternoon arrival and nightfall, the unseen danger that had been circling Hinterkaifeck was ready to move. The routine of that day would give way to the violence of the night, and the stillness that followed would only be broken when outsiders finally came days later. For Maria, it was a job that never truly began, and a first night that would be her last. The next moments would bring the first steps of the killer's plan into motion. How did 6 people end up separated and killed in the barn without raising alarm? That question has been at the center of this case for over a century. Investigators who reached Hinterkaifeck found 4 of the 6 victims inside the barn itself, laid together in a way that did not look accidental. The arrangement of those bodies suggested the killer had control over the scene for a significant amount of time, and that there was a clear reason for placing them there. The difficulty for anyone trying to understand what happened is explaining how the killer managed to draw each victim into the barn without the others suspecting something was wrong. The first working theory from investigators was that the killer used the animals to create a reason for someone to check the barn. On an active farm, sounds from the stables could signal a real problem, such as an animal in distress, a broken fence, or a predator nearby. These were situations that demanded a quick response. If someone heard strange noises coming from that direction, the natural reaction would be to walk out and check. That theory, on its surface, could explain why each person left the safety of the house, one at a time. But later, examinations of the property challenged this idea. Evidence suggested that someone inside the house might not have heard cries or struggles from the barn at all. The structure was built with thick wooden walls, and the distance between the living quarters and the stable area was enough to muffle noise, especially if doors were closed. The barn itself was part of a connected arrangement common to Bavarian farms, where the stable stood under a shared roof, but was separate enough that work inside it could go unnoticed by someone in the living areas. The sound insulation from construction and materials meant voices could easily have been contained within the barn, masking any shout or scream that might have given the others time to run. With that understanding, the killer's task may have been simpler. They did not need to eliminate all noise. They only needed to prevent an alarm that carried back into the house. The first victim is believed to have been Andreas Gruber. At around 63 years old, he would have been the one most likely to investigate a disturbance in the stable. Once inside, in the shadowed area near the animals and feed, the killer struck. The weapon was the farm's own mattock, a multi-purpose tool with a long handle and a heavy, sharp-edged head used for breaking up soil and chopping wood. It was the kind of tool anyone on the property could locate quickly. After Andreas, the sequence continued. His wife, Cecilia, likely followed next, drawn either by curiosity over his delay or by the same noise that had brought him in. She, too, was killed in the barn. Victoria, the couple's adult daughter, was the third. She would have been alone in the house with her 2 children when she realized both parents had gone toward the stable but not come back. In a farm family, that kind of unexplained delay could not be ignored. Whether she also heard something from the barn or simply went to find them, her path ended in the same place. The youngest of the 4 found in the barn was also named Cecilia, the 7-year-old granddaughter of Andreas. She may have followed her mother or been called to the barn in some way. The exact order after the first death is based on reconstruction from body positioning and blood patterns, but all four were killed without alerting the others inside the living quarters. The first three were likely attacked without much chance to defend themselves. Reports later suggested that little Cecilia may have still been alive after the initial blow, injured and unable to escape, left in the barn alongside the others for hours before dying. The way their bodies were treated after death stands out. Rather than leaving them where they fell, the killer placed them together, stacking hay or straw over them. The layering did not look like an attempt at a full burial. It was more of a concealment, enough to cover the scene from casual view. Arranging bodies in this way requires time and a lack of outside threat. Each movement risks noise and delay, but here there was no rush. That detail, as much as the killings themselves, shows the killer had confidence they would not be interrupted. The choice of weapon and the setting also suggest a degree of planning. A mattock in a barn is easy to reach and quiet to use compared to firearms. Someone familiar with farm routines would know where to find it and how to handle it. They would also understand how to use the barn's interior to control visibility. Once a victim stepped inside and moved far enough from the door, the path back was cut off. Aggressive action could be taken without witnesses on the outside. Investigators considering these facts pointed to one unavoidable conclusion. The person committing the murders knew the farm well enough to predict movements, anticipate reactions, and use the property's layout for their own advantage. This was not the work of someone wandering into the area by chance. It required familiarity with the family's habits and the confidence that each victim could be approached separately without causing an immediate alarm. The barn's position, partly shielded from the main house, and the muted sound between them worked in the killer's favor. By the time all four were dead in the barn, the killer had already removed the majority of the household's adult members. That left only the infant Joseph and the new maid, Maria Baumgartner, inside the house. What makes this stage of events so stark is the precision with which it split the group. In a matter of hours, or possibly less, every person who could resist or raise an alarm was taken out of the equation. Each was drawn to the same location, under circumstances they were trained by life on a farm to see as routine. The conflicting evidence about sound from the barn remains one of the points that makes the reconstruction uncertain. If screams could not be heard, the killer's job was easier. If they could have been heard but were not, it raises questions about timing and about what the two people left in the house were doing during those moments. Some reconstructions propose that the murders in the barn happened very quickly, with each victim dying almost immediately after entering, giving the others little or no time to respond before it was their turn to be lured in. The care taken to conceal the four bodies suggests the killer was thinking about what might happen if someone arrived unexpectedly in the yard. A visitor might notice the absence of the family from the house, but stacked and covered in the barn, the dead would not be immediately visible. That act also removed visual and physical evidence from where it was created, making it slightly harder for anyone later to reconstruct the exact sequence. What it did not change was the overall impression. Whoever did this was in full control of the scene and the timing. The barn killings mark the point where the crime shifted from isolated incidents in the previous months to an all-consuming act that left no one on the property safe. They also show that the killer was comfortable spending time in one location with multiple victims present. Each act of violence increased the chance of discovery, yet the killer appears to have worked without visible hurry. That confidence says as much about their understanding of the farm's isolation as it does about their intent. It is in these details, the choice of method, the use of the barn's design, the concealment, that the picture emerges of someone deeply familiar with Hinterkaifeck. They knew how to use the environment to separate and control the victims. They also knew that once the adults were gone, the final killings could happen without any risk of serious resistance. When the work in the barn was done, 4 bodies lay together under hay. The farm's strongest and most capable defenders were gone. Only those inside the living quarters remained. The killer's next steps would take them into the house itself, where the last of the family and the newcomer who had arrived only that afternoon were still unaware of what had already happened just outside their door. After the barn killings, the killer was not finished. The 4 bodies lay concealed under hay, but inside the house 2 more lived, and, at that moment, had no reason to believe anything had changed. The distance and design between the living quarters and the barn meant that silence there did not mean safety. The killer now turned toward removing anyone left who could later tell what they had seen. The first of the remaining victims was 2-year-old Joseph. He was Victoria's younger child, still an infant in most ways. At the time of the murders, he was resting in his bassinet in a room inside the main house. A bassinet kept him low to the floor. Surrounded by blankets or cloth, in an environment where nothing around him would have hinted at violence, only a short distance away. The killer's entry into this space would not have been contested. There were no defensive wounds on his body. That absence speaks to the speed and certainty of the attack. A single blow with the same mattock used in the barn ended his life before he could cry out. Maria Baumgartner was in her own upstairs room. She had arrived that very afternoon, gone through the process of meeting the family, settling her belongings, and being shown the spaces where she would work and sleep. After the barn killings, she was likely unaware of any disturbance. Without knowing about the unfolding events, there was no reason for her to bar her door or take up anything for protection. She was found in her bed, still in sleeping clothes, with no evidence that she had fought back. This lack of struggle is consistent with the conclusion that she was attacked, either while resting or in the first moments after seeing the killer enter her room. The use of the same weapon ties the deaths inside the house directly to those in the barn. A mattock taken from the property is easy to carry between the two areas and requires no special preparation. This choice of weapon is practical for someone already familiar with farming tools, and in this case, it was also consistent across all 6 killings, leaving no doubt that a single person could have managed the sequence without switching instruments. For investigators, the detail that there were no defensive wounds on Maria or Josef narrowed the possibilities for how the attacks in the house occurred. A fight leaves marks not only on the victim, but often on the attacker. Here, the pattern was different. Both killings appear to have been fast, targeted strikes made without warning. It shows the continuation of a method seen in the barn, approaching the victim from a position of advantage and not allowing time for them to react. One of the most disturbing findings after the murders was that little Cecilia, the 7-year-old granddaughter, may have still been alive after her attack in the barn. Reports from the investigation record that she lay among the straw for several hours before dying, during which she tore out tufts of her own hair. This detail suggests both the severity of her head injury and the prolonged suffering she endured. It also means that while the killer was moving from the barn to the house to kill Josef and Maria, one of the earlier victims was not yet dead. The calculated nature of proceeding with additional murders, knowing someone was still wounded in the other building, is part of what marks this crime as chilling in its control. This stage of the killings added 2 more bodies to the total and removed the last living witnesses other than the killer. The fact that these attacks were carried out without hesitation after the earlier violence reflects the same level of calm seen in the barn. There was no apparent rush, no evidence that the killer feared discovery in the moments between these acts. Even after 6 people were dead or dying, the crime scene showed signs that the perpetrator had the freedom to move at will between buildings. The locations of Josef and Maria's bodies also suggested that the killer knew the layout of the home. There was no searching recorded in the scene that would indicate confusion over where people might be sleeping. Moving quickly to exactly where each target lay points to prior knowledge, either from visits to the farm in the past or from observing the household before the crime. For Maria, who had been there only hours, being struck while in bed underscores that her role in this was only to be counted among the occupants. There is no evidence that she was a specific target for any reason beyond being present. The quick dispatch of the final 2 victims also meant there was little to alter or clean in the home before the killer could do whatever came next. The barn scene, with 4 people hidden under straw, and the interior scene, with both remaining victims left where they fell, showed consistency in how the bodies were treated after death. There was covering in one location, none in the other, but in both cases there was no panic evident in those arrangements. For modern readers, it is hard to separate the killings from the knowledge that they were followed by an extended period in which the killer stayed on the property. But in the sequence of events as they happened, the move from the barn to the house is a clear inflection point. Up to then, there was still the possibility that someone inside could have been warned or escaped. Once Maria and Josef were dead, that possibility was gone. The nature of the attacks inside the house aligns with a methodical approach. There was no wasted movement, no change in weapon, and no sign of hesitation. That level of control over a scene with multiple victims, spread across 2 separate interiors, remains one of the reasons investigators at the time, and later, have pointed toward a person comfortable within that space. It is not only the violence that leaves an impression, but also the composure with which the violence was delivered. Maria's first and only night at Hinterkaifeck ended without her ever knowing the history of the strange events in the months before. Josef's brief life ended in the setting meant to be safest for a child, quiet, indoors, with family nearby. In both cases, those protective conditions meant nothing against an attacker who had already removed every possible source of defense. The absence of defensive wounds is more than a forensic detail. It illustrates the imbalance of power in those final moments, and the choice to execute the killings in a way that eliminated even the chance of calling out. The image of the wounded Cecilia in the barn still alive as her younger brother and the new maid were killed elsewhere, adds to the weight of those hours. It shows not just an act of violence against each victim, but a sequence that allowed suffering to continue while the killer carried on. That absence of interruption, coupled with the deliberate completion of the killings, suggests an attacker who was willing to prolong the events rather than be satisfied with fewer deaths. By the time the final two in the house were dead, the total stood at 6. There were no animals harmed, no signs of ransacking in search of valuables, no immediate departure. The killings completed the removal of every human on the property except the one who had done it. What happened in the hours and days after would reveal that the crime did not conclude here. Instead of leaving, the murderer stayed, moving freely between the same rooms that had just seen the attacks. Later discovery would show that fires were lit, food was eaten, and animals were cared for as if the farmhouse was still occupied in the normal way. But at this point in the timeline, Maria in her bed and Joseph in his bassinet were the last in a chain of swift, controlled killings that ended any possibility of resistance. Instead of leaving after the murders, the killer stayed at Hinterkaifeck. For roughly 3 days, they lived in the same farmhouse where 6 people now lay dead. The details of what was done during that time make the case even more unsettling. Food from the kitchen was eaten, the entire supply of bread finished, fires were lit, sending smoke up from the chimney for anyone passing to see, and in the barn, cattle were fed and watered as usual. Someone not only stayed, but kept the visible parts of farm life going. Police later noted these details in their reports. The family's meals had been drawn from loaves of bread gone and basic staples reduced. Fires were not an accident or leftover embers, they were deliberately made. This meant whoever stayed there used the rooms not as a hiding place, but as a home. Tending livestock was another deliberate choice. It kept the animals alive and quiet, which also gave the appearance that the household was running normally. For someone familiar with farming, that would also mean avoiding the added noise or distress that could bring unwanted attention. In the days right after the killings, there were visitors to the property. A coffee seller, a repairman, and others came by for routine reasons. The farm had a reputation for privacy, so finding the door unanswered was not enough to raise alarm. Seeing smoke from the chimney was another reason to think everything was fine. Smoke meant heat, meant someone was moving around inside. Coupled with animals still being cared for, it gave no outward signal of what lay inside the barn and house. This ability to blend normal tasks into a cover for homicide points toward deep familiarity with the victim's routines. Feeding cattle is not something a random intruder is likely to attempt for days unless they know how to do it. Handling large animals requires skill and comfort, especially in an unfamiliar place. The killer not only had the willingness to do it, but seems to have anticipated that keeping the animals alive would ensure the scene outside looked undisturbed. The bread and simple food supplies were likely chosen because they were easy to prepare without much disruption. It is also worth noting what staying actually meant in this context. The killer was living among the evidence. Every room still held what had happened. In most murder cases, police see offenders flee quickly, worrying that someone will discover them or that the authorities will arrive. Here, the person responsible made the opposite calculation. They believed they could stay without being caught, long enough to eat, sleep, and maintain the farm's appearance. It shows a high degree of control over their own emotions. From a psychological view, staying could signal several things. It can suggest a lack of urgency, believing discovery was unlikely in the short term. It might indicate they wanted to remove or alter evidence. The longer the scene went untouched by outsiders, the more chance there was to change small details, take away items, or shift things out of sight. It could also mean the killer wanted to occupy the victim's space, an act seen in some crimes where control over both person and place is part of the motive. Whatever the reason, the decision to remain had consequences for the investigation. Any evidence that could have been preserved in its original state was being handled or moved for days before authorities saw it. Footprints, tool positions, and even traces of the killer's own presence during the murders could have been altered or destroyed in this post-crime period. And because neighbors did not suspect a problem, no one came to check closely enough to interrupt. The location worked in the killer's favor. Haar, the nearest small community, knew the Grubers as self-contained. In towns like that in 1922, it was not unexpected for a family to go about their work without seeing others for days. Some farms could go nearly a week without visits, especially between market days. Mail carriers came on schedule, but unless they were due, the gap between interactions gave cover for someone wanting to stay unseen. Even when people passed near the farmhouse, they did not see anything that pointed to trouble. The chimney smoke was a key part of this deception. It gave off the impression that fires were being lit for normal household use. Cooking, warmth, drying clothes. The reality that the fire was being used by the killer was hidden. Feeding animals is another detail that would matter to anyone passing by. Livestock in distress can be noisy. A barn of unfed cattle makes a noticeable sound, and neighbors might follow that noise to offer help. Keeping them content eliminated that risk. The fact that the animals survived those days is a detail worth dwelling on. It shows the killer was willing to put in the time and effort to keep them alive, which suggests not just familiarity with farm operation, but possibly some attachment to keeping the property in order. This was not someone tearing the place apart in a rushed search. It was not looted. Most of the household's valuable items were left untouched. The use of resources seems centered on sustaining the killer's stay rather than taking goods away. From the perspective of those who later tried to reconstruct the timeline, these choices point away from panic and toward planning. A person who decides to stay for multiple nights must be confident in several factors: that no one will check in immediately, that they can meet their own needs there, and that they know enough about the space to move around without drawing attention. All three appear to have been true in this case. It is also worth considering what the killer's daily existence might have looked like in those 3 days. Meals prepared simply from what was at hand, tending to animals in the relative safety of the barn, spending time in the rooms of the house, perhaps even sleeping in the victims' beds, all while knowing that under the straw in the barn and in an upstairs room, the bodies of those who lived there remained. This scenario adds to the sense of calculation. It was not simply about hiding. It was about functioning within the space as though nothing had happened. The killer's choice to keep using the house, rather than abandoning it, meant that they shared the same walls, the same air, with the results of what they had done. That kind of presence over days suggests a threshold of detachment most people cannot reach. They did not leave when they could have. They did not destroy property. They did not leave animals to starve or fields to stand untended. In the outward details, they kept things in order. The longer they stayed, the more likely it was that small changes were made that will never be known. Items might have been moved, documents or tools handled, and subtle traces wiped away. The idea that anything from those days could have been staged is part of why the case remains so debated. Without a prompt discovery, the scene the police walked into was already altered from the one that existed on the night of March 31st. In other cases where killers remain at a scene, it is usually for hours, not days. The rarity of a 3-day stay marks Hinterkaifeck as especially unusual. Investigators saw it as an action that moved beyond survival or immediate escape. Whether it was to cover tracks, to mislead, or simply because they felt safe, the choice to remain is one of the most disturbing features of the case. Neighbors who later tried to piece together their memories recalled seeing smoke, but thinking little of it. In the absence of direct contact, life at the farm appeared unchanged from a distance. Without an obvious break in rhythms, there was nothing to make them interrupt their own routines to check inside. That visual reassurance is likely exactly what allowed the killer to finish their time there without incident. This was the part of the crime that extended the danger past the violence. For those 3 days, the person responsible lived freely on the property. They were there when visitors came to the yard and left again, none the wiser. They were there each morning when the animals were let out and fed. The attack itself was fatal to 6 people, but the presence afterward shows an added dimension, confidence that the murderer had the time and conditions to remain in place. It was only when the farm's unusual quiet finally outlasted even the Gruber's private habits that anyone thought to press closer. The silence that followed years of isolation was, in the end, what forced others to step through the doors and see what had happened inside. Days passed before anyone stepped inside to find out what had happened at Hinterkaifeck. In that time, the farm looked, from a distance, like it was going on as usual. Smoke rose steadily from the chimney. The cattle were fed. Nothing on the outside suggested 6 people inside the property were no longer alive. On April 1st, the day after the murders, 2 coffee sellers, Hans Shirovsky and Eduard Shirovsky, made their way to the farm. They came to take an order as they had before. When they reached the yard, they noticed the gate to the machine house stood open. No one came to meet them. They waited for a while, calling out, but there was no answer. They decided to leave, assuming the family was away for some reason. At that point, there was no thought that danger might be involved. People in the area were used to the Grubers keeping to themselves. 3 more days went by. On April 4th, local mechanic Albert Hoffner came to repair an engine in one of the outbuildings. He found the same silence. For him, the only signs of life came from the animals and the dog in the barn. He waited for about an hour before starting his work. The repair took more than 4 hours. During that time, no one came out of the house, and no one spoke from inside. Despite the length of his visit, he left at the end without going into the living quarters or the barn. That absence of curiosity or alarm reflected how easily isolation could mask trouble. While these visits came and went without changing anything, people nearby began to notice smaller signs that something might be wrong. The absence of 7-year-old Cecilia from school was one of them. The family also failed to appear at Sunday worship. These gaps stood out because, for all their privacy, the Grubers rarely missed such fixtures in the weekly routine. These details reached Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighbor who knew the family. On April 4th, Schlittenbauer decided to send his 16-year-old son Johann and his 9-year-old stepson Josef to the farm to see if they could find anyone there. When the boys returned without a clear answer, he gathered 2 other men, Michael Pohl and Jakob Sigel. The 3 set out together to the property that afternoon. It was around 3:30 p.m. when they reached Hinterkaifeck. They headed first toward the barn. The building was large, connected to the living quarters, but distinct enough to be entered separately. Inside, the light was dim except where openings let it in. As they moved toward the area where hay was kept, they found an uneven stack that looked out of place. When they shifted the covering, they exposed the bodies of Andreas Gruber, his wife Cecilia, their daughter Victoria Gabriel, and the younger Cecilia. The 4 were lying close together. Each showed wounds to the head. The way they were covered made it clear someone had taken deliberate steps to conceal them. For Schlittenbauer and the others, the scene removed any doubt that foul play had taken place. From there, they went into the house. Inside one of the bedrooms, they found 2-year-old Joseph in his bassinet. He was dead, killed in the same way as the others. Upstairs, in a room set apart for the help, they found Maria Baumgartner. She was still in bed, dressed for sleeping. The position of her body and the nature of her wounds suggested a quick, fatal strike while she was resting. At that point, all 6 of the household's occupants had been found, 4 in the barn, 1 in a bedroom on the main floor, and 1 upstairs. News of the discovery travelled quickly through the surrounding area, drawing more people to the farm. That influx, while a natural reaction, had serious consequences for the investigation. Neighbours, villagers, and those simply curious came into the buildings. Some moved bodies to see them better, adjusted objects, and even prepared food in the kitchen. Each action disturbed the crime scene further. Police who arrived soon after were faced with locations already altered from how the killer had left them. In modern terms, much of the physical evidence was compromised before it could be studied. Traces that might have shown a sequence of movement, the exact position of objects, or the identity of the killer were handled, shifted, or worn away. Even with this, investigators began their work, examining the state of the bodies, the tool used, and the arrangement of the barn. The order in which the bodies were discovered also fixed the image of the crime in the public memory. The barn contained the family's 3 adults working the land and the school-aged child, while the house held the infant and the maid. That arrangement matched what investigators believed had occurred. The killer dealt with the adults and older child first, using a reason to draw them into the barn one by one before moving to the house to kill the remaining 2. For those familiar with farming, the barn naturally drew attention when something was wrong. It was the place where animals could be in distress or where tools needed for a task might be fetched. The delayed discovery meant the killer's time on the farm between March 31st and April 4th had gone entirely uninterrupted. During that period, they were able to eat, rest, and tend the animals without interference. The idea that these normal-seeming signs, smoke in the chimney, well-fed cattle, were masking a multiple homicide added to the case's notoriety from the start. The very habits that reassured visitors allowed the killer to avoid suspicion long enough to leave on their own terms. In the days after, the court physician Johann Baptist Ohlmüller performed the autopsies. They were done in the barn itself, one day after the discovery. Moving bodies through that space again, with many people still coming and going, further disturbed what might have been left to study. It reflected the limits of resources and practices in rural Bavaria at the time, where examinations were often done on site rather than transported elsewhere. The discovery also forced those who knew the family to reconsider the events of the months before. Now, the unexplained newspaper, the footprints without a return trail, the broken lock, and the maid's sudden departure sat in a line that pointed towards something building toward violence. Neighbours who had offered to help guard the property could see how refusing had sealed the isolation. The meetings with no answer in the days after the murders became, in hindsight, moments when the killer was likely only yards away, maintaining the illusion of an occupied, functioning farm. For the men who first walked into the barn, the memory was lasting. Their entry ended a period in which a killer had sole use of the property and began the official handling of the crime. But by then, the damage to the investigation's clarity was already done. The earliest signs that could have been collected, the order of footprints in the yard, the freshness of hay or feed, the specific placement of tools were lost beneath the changes made in those first reactions by townspeople. Even with that, the discoveries laid out the full cost of what had happened. 6 people dead, each killed on their own land, most of them separated from each other in their last moments. The barn, which had been a place of work and routine, now held the majority of the family. The home, meant to be a place of rest, had been the scene of the final attacks. Together, they formed a crime scene that did not match any simple break-in or robbery, but something that required knowledge of the family's patterns and movements. The moment Lorenz Schlittenbauer and his companions moved the hay in the barn was the point where the hidden reality of Hinterkaifeck became visible. Everything else, from the visitors walking away days earlier to the work done by the mechanic, had existed inside the larger illusion that the farm was going on as usual. Once broken, that illusion cast all the earlier events in a different light. From there, the investigation would have to work backward, from a compromised scene, through the thin timeline of visitors and sightings, to a chain of unsettling incidents in the months before. What stood out most was that the threat had been present on the property for days, without any of the usual signals of danger. It meant that the real danger at Hinterkaifeck had not only arrived quietly, it had been given the time and space to stay until it chose to leave. Of America's most terrifying cults, he began as a boy, abandoned by his 16-year-old mother, shuffled through reform schools, and locked away for much of his youth. But how does a path shaped by childhood neglect turn into a story of murder and manipulation that shook Hollywood and the world? Tonight, we trace the journey from a boy no one wanted to the man who convinced others to kill in his name. How does being left behind as a child shape the way someone views the world? For some, it creates resilience and an even stronger drive to find belonging later in life. For Charles Manson, it laid the foundation for a life where trust was fragile, rejection was expected, and human connection became something to twist and control rather than cherish. His story did not begin with crime, but with the absence of stability that left him searching for the kind of family he would never truly find. Charles Mills Manson came into the world on November 12, 1934. His mother, Kathleen, had only recently turned 16. She was unmarried, troubled, and far from prepared to raise a child. Accounts from his early life often point out how little time she actually spent caring for him, leaving him with relatives or anyone willing to watch him for a while. When he was still a baby, she was arrested after being involved in crimes with her brother, which left Charles largely stranded. From the very beginning, his connection to family life was shaky, fragmented, and unreliable. His mother would vanish for days on drinking sprees, sometimes gone long enough to make her infant son entirely dependent on neighbors or distant relatives. For a child forming their first bonds, stability was absent, and that absence became a constant. The state intervened more than once during these years. Charles moved between foster placements, relatives willing to give temporary care, and even institutional settings. Nothing lasted long. Every time he began to adjust to a new home, the arrangement fell apart, reinforcing the message that no environment could be trusted to remain steady. For many children going through the foster system, psychologists note that instability leaves deep emotional scars. The reality of never knowing where one will sleep next, or which adults will be there tomorrow, influences how the child will interpret relationships in adulthood. Manson's early life was almost a direct reflection of this. What shaped him was not only instability, but the quality of care he received when people did take him in. He often faced neglect, or worse, indifference. If he received affection, it came without reliability. If he found kindness, it often disappeared as soon as he had grown used to it. These shifting patterns gave him no clear image of what love meant. Family to him became an idea, rather than an experience. Without secure attachments, trust in others never took root. When Kathleen briefly attempted to care for him after being released from prison, the effort was short-lived. Soon enough, Charles would again be sent away, reinforcing the sense that he was a burden. Child development research consistently shows that abandonment, repeated separations, and lack of stable caregivers are tied to higher rates of behavioral problems in later years. The absence of security often leads children to either seek constant reassurance or, in other cases, shield themselves with manipulation and control. For Manson, the second pattern emerged. He began to adjust, not by expecting care, but by bracing for abandonment and preemptively controlling interactions around him. If people eventually left, he wanted to make sure he left his mark first. These early lessons set in long before he would carry out acts of crime, yet they dictated the way he related to nearly everyone he met. At school, the instability showed itself in behavior. Teachers struggled with him as a withdrawn and sometimes disruptive child. Truancy records followed him even as a young boy. Court hearings documented frequent absence from class, with authorities already beginning to view him as a problem case. Instead of understanding that his difficulties reflected deep-seated trauma, the institutions he encountered treated him as a troublemaker. Many children in similar circumstances might have been offered therapy, structured mentorship, or patient guidance. In the 1930s and 40s, resources were scarce, and the common approach was punishment or placement in harsher environments. By the time he was old enough to know the difference between being wanted and being discarded, Manson had experienced rejection more than most adults would see in a lifetime. Each foster home that gave him back, every institution that failed to rehabilitate him, added to an inner script that told him he had only himself to rely on. While many children form their earliest sense of love through consistent parenting, Manson formed his through abandonment. Being banished became an expectation, so he prepared for it by becoming less attached to people and more skillful at presenting himself in ways that gained him temporary security. Patterns like this often generate a deep distrust of authority as well. When a child sees adults make promises that collapse, or notices that rules are often manipulated by those in charge, respect for figures of authority weakens. For Manson, whose early life involved moving from one supervising figure to the next, authority came across as something unreliable. Sometimes rules meant protection, other times they led to punishment. He began reading people rather than obeying them, because that skill would save him from the sting of rejection that so often followed blind trust. There was no strong father figure during these years either. His mother's partners were inconsistent, often passing through without lasting impact. When Kathleen herself eventually cared less and less for her son, it left him almost entirely without nurturing adults. Instead, extended relatives and state agencies became his world. The lesson he absorbed was clear. Family was not a matter of blood or permanence, but of circumstance. This interpretation would much later resurface in the way he created his own family out of broken people like himself, convincing them to submit to his system because he knew firsthand the desperation that came from lacking one. Research in developmental psychology has repeatedly shown how children adapt to neglect through survival skills that may look functional in the short term, but are often harmful later in life. For example, mistrust of caregivers can encourage independence at a young age, but in adulthood it can create patterns of manipulation or avoidance when intimacy becomes too threatening. Manson fit into this trajectory almost perfectly. By his teenage years, he was not primarily a criminal yet, but the foundation for manipulative tendencies was already established. His life was not a straight fall into violence. It was a gradual training ground, where rejection taught him the only way to survive was to master the ability to use others before they abandoned him. The evidence can be seen in his repeated returns to care institutions. Unlike many children who might spend years in a stable foster household, Manson bounced between environments. A brief placement, then a removal. A guardian attempting to help, then giving up. This cycle gave him no sense of permanence, and instead reinforced an identity built on instability. Each new placement was both an opportunity and a threat, and in that uncertainty, Manson learned early to watch, to predict, and to mold himself into what might get him accepted, if only temporarily. To understand the boy he was, one must focus less on what he did wrong and more on what was missing around him. The playground shifts, the lack of consistent affection, the feeling of being handed off like an object. These were his first teachers. Far from the normal experiences most children encountered, for Manson, they became the backdrop to every memory. When home feels temporary, the word family itself begins to lose meaning. He would later use that word to describe his cult, giving followers what he himself had longed for, but twisting it into something more sinister than nurturing. By his earliest teenage years, the transition from neglected child to institutionalized youth came almost without resistance. Frequent placements had already conditioned him for institution walls, so entry into formal correctional systems did not feel as foreign as it might to others. For him, these systems felt like a continuation of the instability he had always known. It was not so much a shock, as it was an extension of the same lesson. People leave, structures punish, and survival depends on staying one step ahead. What began as a childhood of rejection would seamlessly lead into years of confinement and correctional institutions, each promising reform, but often delivering more scars than change. What happens when every attempt to correct a child ends up breaking them further? For Charles Manson, the path into reform schools began before he reached his teenage years. By the age of 12, truancy and petty theft had already put him on the radar of authorities. Skipping school had become routine, and stealing food or bikes was how he spent his free time. Eventually, the court stepped in, sending him to his first reform school. It was advertised as a place to put troubled kids back on the right track, but instead of rehabilitation, it introduced him to harsher punishments than he had ever known at home. The institutions he entered during these years were places with rigid routines and strict hierarchies. On the surface, they promised correction with wake-up calls at dawn, mandatory chores, and lessons meant to instill discipline. But behind the structure was an environment that broke kids down rather than built them up. Staff members used corporal punishment freely, sometimes beating boys with belts or wooden paddles for the slightest misstep. Humiliation was also common. A child who tried to run away might be forced to stand in front of others while guards mocked him. For someone like Manson, who was already carrying a sense of rejection, these experiences drove the idea even deeper that care and authority were bound to cruelty. Life inside these schools was less about education and more about survival. The stronger kids often dominated the weaker ones, forming their own sets of rules within the walls. Violence was not just tolerated, in many cases, it was encouraged by staff who thought toughness would teach respect. Beatings between boys often went unchecked, and those who could not protect themselves quickly learned to attach to someone stronger or find another way to avoid being targeted. At 12, Manson was small and vulnerable, but he adapted by watching, learning, and eventually turning to manipulation to navigate these unwritten rules. Escape became his answer to the brutality. Records show that he tried to run away multiple times, often sneaking out at night or slipping away during work duties. The freedom never lasted long. He was usually caught within days, brought back, and punished. Run away, caught, punished. This became the cycle of his reform school years. Each time he returned, the discipline grew harsher, the humiliation deeper. But with every failed escape, another lesson attached itself. If he could not fight or overpower, he could still control. He began using lies and charm to get out of chores, to avoid beatings, or to convince others to do favors for him. These strategies did not remove him from the reform system, but they built the psychological tools he would use for the rest of his life. Survival was not just about running, it was about bending people to his will. Manson's manipulation skills grew sharper every year. Nobody taught him love or empathy inside these institutions. What he learned instead was that control could come from words, from reading others closely, and from giving people what they wanted to hear. In walls designed to teach discipline, he discovered persuasion. Living in that atmosphere also blurred the line between victim and aggressor. He was beaten, mocked, and shamed on one hand, and on the other, he learned how to turn smaller boys into allies who did what he asked. He cycled between being the one punished and being the one who escaped punishment by placing blame on others. In many ways, the schools shaped him into a reflection of their own methods. Authority had shown him cruelty, so cruelty became something he repurposed in order to feel safe. The constant running away also hardened him. Each escape was not just a physical act, it was a symbolic rejection of the control institutions tried to place on him. That rejection gave him identity. Even when he knew punishment waited if he was caught, the attempt itself gave him a glimpse of power over his situation. Again and again, Manson embraced this cycle, as though reminding himself that nobody could permanently trap him. He was not a boy being corrected. He was someone resisting, even if that resistance usually ended with him in confinement again. The system he was trapped in did little to adapt to children who ran. Each capture came with routine consequences, but the deeper emotional scar it left was not considered. For Manson, every slap, every whipping, every public humiliation was another nail pressing into the idea that authority meant abuse and that survival could only come through defying it. Rehabilitation never happened, because punishment defined the entire structure. Researchers examining institutions like the ones Manson passed through in the 1940s and 50s have noted that the combination of violence, rigid order, and a lack of compassion often produced more hardened offenders rather than preventing crime. Children raised in those environments often internalized aggression and shame rather than discipline and respect. Manson was no exception. The young boy who had once been shaped by abandonment was now being remolded by brutality. The repetition of these cycles gave him practice in controlling his own sense of fear. While other boys broke down under isolation or humiliation, Manson began observing what the staff wanted and playing along until he could find another opportunity to escape. It was training, in a way, but not the type the institutions intended. He was not absorbing integrity or morality. He was absorbing strategy, noting weaknesses in adults, and practicing how to perform an image of obedience until he could slip through a crack. The cycle trained him to wear masks, masks that later became central in his manipulation of others. His reform school years also exposed him more directly to criminal peers. Around him were boys already involved in theft, burglary, and in some cases, violence. With so little positive guidance, it was not surprising that Manson began adopting their behaviors. These institutions frequently became breeding grounds for strategies in law-breaking. Young people shared tips and methods with one another, each teaching what they had learned on the streets before being locked up. Manson soaked in these conversations, gaining knowledge he would put to use in his teens once he was released. Being surrounded by correctional walls so early also normalized them for him. For some children, reform school traumatized them enough to never want to return. For Manson, it almost became familiar. The guards, the schedules, the punishments, these things were expected, even ordinary. When he was not confined, the world outside began to feel less natural than life inside. That sense of comfort with institutions explains why adult prisons later never quite broke him. By the time most men feared them, Manson had already grown up inside similar structures. The more time he spent in reform schools, the clearer the contrast between their supposed purpose and their actual function became. They claimed to reshape boys into good citizens, but what they really did was instill resilience through force and deepen the sharp edges of street survival. For Manson, that meant his natural drive to avoid pain and rejection shifted into a conscious decision to manipulate, sidestep, and if needed, retaliate. He entered at 12 as a truant child, but by his mid-teens, he was someone who had already rehearsed how to play victim and aggressor at the same time. Each failed escape doubled as practice for the games he would play later in life. Persuading guards, misleading peers, and studying the reactions of authority figures became exercises in control. When his peers fought with fists, Manson fought with manipulation. The cruelty of the school gave him victims, and being caught made him a victim in return. He wore both roles, slipping between them as it suited his situation, preparing him for the complex persona he would one day wield as a cult leader. By the time his reform school years were nearing an end, the boy who had once been desperate for acceptance had begun replacing that desire with hunger for control. His distrust of authority, honed by endless punishments, evolved into calculated defiance. He became less interested in simply running away and more invested in managing the people around him. The constant failures of the system convinced him that adults could not be trusted, and rules were meaningless if he could learn how to bend them. This cycle of reform schools built both a victim and a manipulator in the same person. Manson had endured humiliation, rejection, and beatings, but he had also learned how to spin those experiences into tools for control. By his later teenage years, he was not just a boy acting out. He was someone steadily practicing the very skills that made him dangerous. His days of truancy and escape attempts turned into nights of planning and outsmarting. He was carrying forward not rehabilitation, but technique. From childhood rejection to reform school punishments, it was now only a matter of progression. His early crimes would expand beyond truancy and small theft. By his late teens, he was committing offenses that no longer looked like childish mistakes, but like a pattern, setting him on a permanent course with the justice system. By his teenage years, Charles Manson was spending more time inside juvenile halls and correctional institutions than he was in any kind of home. The pattern that had begun with reform schools carried into early adulthood. Police records from this period show arrests for car theft, small robberies, and forgery. None of these crimes were extraordinary in themselves. They were the kind of offenses that kept law enforcement busy with troubled young men across the country. What made Manson different was not the scale of the crimes, but the relentless cycle in which he committed them, was caught, served time, and returned to them again without pause. For him, confinement was no longer a punishment. It was rapidly becoming the backdrop of his life. Car theft was among his most common offenses. In the post-war years, stealing cars and traveling across state lines was frequent among young offenders. It was a quick way to feel freedom without the responsibility of ownership. For Manson, who had already practiced escape again and again during his reform school years, taking a car was just another form of running. When caught, he often faced new charges that tied him closer to the federal system. Armed robbery came around the same period. In one case, he used a gun to intimidate others, though accounts vary on how dangerous the situations actually became. The pattern stood out. He moved easily between small, reckless thefts and crimes with higher stakes. Check forgery also entered his list of offenses. At a time when paper checks were common, forging them allowed quick access to money with little upfront cost. But forgery required planning, not just impulse. Manson was showing that his crimes were not only about acting out, He was learning to manipulate systems, to fake trust, and to exploit expectations. This type of crime mirrored the skills he had already begun to use in reform schools when lying or playing roles got him out of punishment. Now, those same skills were moving him deeper into the criminal world. Whenever he left one institution, he slipped into crime again almost right away. There was no long stretch of freedom between sentences, no real attempt at starting over. The courtroom, the jail cell, the parole hearing, these became parts of an ongoing routine. To him, they were not interruptions in his life, they were his life. For most people, incarceration is a disruption. For Manson, it was the environment he recognized. If freedom was supposed to feel natural, it did not feel that way to him. Every time he walked outside of walls and fences, he gravitated back into crime that would take him inside again. Criminologists, studying habitual youth offenders, note that the system often produces comfort in confinement. When a young person enters institutions early and often, the routines and predictability of custody can feel more reliable than the uncertainty of the outside world. Inside prison or reform school, you know when meals will be served, you know the score of authority, and you know who can be trusted or avoided. Outside, there are jobs to keep, bills to pay, and relationships to maintain, things Manson had never practiced successfully. For him, it is not difficult to see why confinement began to feel familiar, maybe even safer. That comfort also explains why his time in custody never seemed to break him. While most people dread prison, Manson operated as though he belonged there. He adjusted quickly, often quicker than older men locked up alongside him. Guards reported how easily he took to the structure, following routines that mirrored what he had already known growing up in juvenile institutions. Rather than fearing the environment, he became a part of it. That ability to adapt was not accidental. It was something he had rehearsed for years. His reliance on charm and manipulation became vital during these years. By watching guards and fellow inmates, he could figure out who might be swayed by flattery, who preferred obedience, and who demanded toughness. He performed roles accordingly. To one person, he was a harmless young man just trying to learn. To another, he was defiant enough to earn respect. He rarely showed the same face to everyone, switching personas as conditions demanded. Those around him often underestimated him, seeing only a small-time thief. Yet every sentence was sharpening his skill in reading and controlling the emotions of others. Consider the way check forgery reflected his psychology. To forge a check, a person must create a believable signature, rely on the trust of a banker or store clerk, and present it with confidence. Even when caught, that action requires a performance. In the same way, Manson's daily life in custody was built on reading others, staging behavior when necessary, and testing whether his act could pass. Each successful moment reinforced that manipulation worked, as well as violence, often better. These lessons were far more important to him than the correction officers understood at the time. In confinement, he was part of a hierarchy. New inmates often feared being at the bottom. They faced intimidation or violence from those higher up. Manson learned to navigate this by attaching himself to stronger personalities, offering services or companionship until he became useful. Once he had secured a place, he could begin pulling others into his orbit. This pattern, linking himself to those with power, then gradually redirecting influence, would play out again years later on a far larger scale. The seeds of those methods were right here in his teenage confinement years. The ongoing rhythm of crime and capture built a psychological loop. Every theft or forgery was not just about money or rebellion, but about reenacting a cycle he already understood. Breaking into a car or presenting a fake check was the first step, but in Manson's mind, being chased and caught was the logical conclusion. Punishment was not unexpected. It was expected. This kind of mentality has been described by researchers as institutional dependency. After repeated confinement, the idea of success outside institutions no longer holds weight. Instead, life becomes a series of temporary freedoms split up by regular stretches behind bars. That cycle was shaping Manson's outlook even before he reached adulthood. The scale of his crimes remained small during these years. He was not orchestrating organized heists or violent campaigns, yet focusing only on the crime itself misses the real transformation taking place. His repeated confinement was teaching him how to survive systems. Whether it was school, reform, or prison, he was learning the inner workings and adapting faster than others. He saw that rules, no matter how strict, were flexible if he observed carefully enough. He recognized that authority could be bent if he spoke the right way, and he knew that among peers, the ability to persuade often replaced the need to fight. Every new arrest confirmed what he already believed about himself. He did not belong to the outside world. His home was inside, where his identity carried on. The outside was temporary, unstable, a place where rejection and failure chased him quickly back into trouble. Inside, he could count on things being the same. It is not surprising that by the time his 20s began, Manson was already resigned to the idea that prison would define his life. Criminology studies suggest that inmates who grow accustomed to confinement at a young age learn forms of resilience many never imagine. They know how to pick up routines without collapsing under pressure. They know the importance of influence over brute force. And they often learn to see institutions not as walls to resist, but systems to manipulate. For Manson, these lessons did not stop at survival. They expanded into ways of controlling situations beyond prison walls. If he could trick a guard into leniency, or persuade a fellow inmate to protect him, then in the free world, he could surely persuade people who lacked that kind of resistance. What makes this period in Manson's life so striking is how ordinary the crimes were, compared to how extraordinary the skills he gained became. No one would look at a teenage car thief and predict a future cult leader, but the constant feedback loop of crime and confinement was not about the thefts themselves. It was about learning how to play a part, how to fool authority, and how to gain loyalty in difficult environments. These abilities, developed in small and unnoticed ways, were becoming the foundation of his later influence over others. By the time Manson entered adulthood, his story was no longer that of a boy abandoned at birth, or of a teenager running from institutions. He had become a man who found his identity in confinement, and who carried with him the tools necessary to reshape others' perceptions. His crimes had not yet reached national significance, and his name held no weight outside local newspapers or police files. But already, he was walking the path from petty thief to manipulator, sharpening the very talents that would later let him transform a lost group of young people into willing followers. Prison had not reformed him, it had trained him. His next sentences would not just punish him for new crimes, they would give him time to practice and refine the art of control. How does a petty thief become a master manipulator? For Charles Manson, the answer did not lie in the streets or in new crimes committed on the outside, but behind prison walls. Confinement offered more than strict schedules and locked doors. It provided long hours, a library of ideas, fellow inmates with their own survival lessons, and opportunities to experiment with persuasion. Instead of using his time to reform, Manson began using it to sharpen something far more dangerous than his criminal record. He started to train his ability to study others, to recognize emotion, and to learn how words could move people as much as action. During his years passing in and out of prison, he was introduced to more than rules of behavior. He stumbled across programs and teachings that aimed at self-improvement. Among them were courses rooted in influence and persuasive communication. Prison libraries often stocked popular self-help and business books of the time, and Manson picked them up. One of the best known was the work of Dale Carnegie, which presented strategies for winning friends, gaining trust, and using charm to influence people in daily life. To many inmates, these were tools to help them re-enter society successfully. To Manson, these words became instructions on how to better control others in the strict environment around him. He did not study the lessons with sympathy or a wish to build genuine human bonds. His focus was on technique. If Carnegie advised smiling to build trust, Manson would mimic smiles at moments when he needed something. If a strategy suggested listening closely to another person's needs, Manson would practice listening, but only to gather information that could later be turned to his advantage. Observers later noted how he often mirrored the emotions and posture of those speaking to him. For a guard, that might mean nodding along to appear cooperative. For an inmate, it could be mimicking frustration to create solidarity. By copying these cues, he could build trust without truly connecting. It made him appear genuine, while the intent was never genuine at all. This method of survival started small. An extra ration, a favor from another inmate, a lighter sentence for good behavior. Each reward confirmed that studying people benefited him. Over time, it was no longer only about survival, it became about power. Manson began practicing how quickly he could read cues and then respond in ways that produced desired results. He learned to raise his voice when confidence was needed, to quiet down when submission would serve him better, and to adopt the mannerisms of those in authority to make conversations smoother. Inside prison walls, experimenting with these tactics carried little risk and constant opportunity. He was not entirely self-taught. Prisons at that time also exposed inmates to programs rooted in new systems of thought. One such system was Scientology, introduced by other inmates and available as self-study. For Manson, these ideas were not embraced as religion but dissected as instructions for control. He became interested in the methods that encouraged examining the minds of others, and using words to shift their thinking. Though he never advanced deeply within that framework, the exposure left him with strategies for persuasion that went far beyond ordinary conversation. The environment of confinement acted as a laboratory, where he could test these methods on people who were often desperate or unstable themselves. Inmates around him sometimes acted as mentors, though not in the sense of guiding him away from crime. Older prisoners taught the younger ones how to manipulate, control, and take advantage of those weaker. Manson listened closely and added these lessons to his growing set of tools, influencing others to carry out an act, distracting staff at the right time, or winning sympathy in front of authority figures. These were techniques he collected like possessions. For every harsh punishment the prison dealt, he found a counterbalance in words and behavior that gave him back a measure of control. Experts who have studied the psychology of incarceration often describe how institutional learning can restructure personalities. A person does not only pick up discipline, they absorb the informal codes of behavior inside, learning when to show emotion, when to hide it, and when to turn it against someone else. For Manson, incarceration all but erased the idea of trusting relationships. Instead, relationships became transactions. Every interaction was weighed for advantage. If someone could be manipulated to give him attention, food, or protection, then saying the right words became as valuable as stealing property once had been. Survival was no longer simply about running away. It was about manipulating others so that his needs were met without exposure. In this closed environment, he also saw the limits of force. Physical fights were common among inmates, but they often carried consequences Manson wanted to avoid. Manipulation, by contrast, left fewer marks and was less risky. It allowed him to achieve results without retaliation. Bit by bit, he refined performance into an art. He could flatter someone one day and then test whether they were willing to act on his request later. His success rate improved because he learned not only what to say, but when to say it. Timing and observation became his strongest assets. Small but telling patterns revealed how far his skills reached. He could persuade some inmates to give up something of value with little in return. He could convince guards he was cooperative, even when he was planning other things behind their backs. He was not the biggest, strongest, or most dangerous man inside those walls, yet he managed to outperform others socially, finding ways to extract favors and support that many prisoners never received. He developed a reputation for charm that appeared disarming at first, but often carried manipulation just below the surface. What stood out most was how easily he could read what people wanted to hear and feed it back to them. If another inmate longed for approval, Manson granted it with words of praise until the man became loyal. If a guard valued quiet obedience, he responded with exaggerated compliance, waiting for an opportunity to exploit leniency later. It was not empathy that motivated him, but calculation. He was not feeling what others felt. He was reading signs as data, processing them, and acting in ways that produced results for him. His power to read people was never about understanding, only about prediction and control. The lessons were consistent across every prison sentence. Time inside gave him daily practice. The feedback loop of action and response, word and reward, taught him that manipulation could be as reliable as theft had once been. What Manson left behind during these years was not a record of violent crime, but a record of psychological growth in the wrong direction. He did not walk out of prison doors with rehabilitation. He walked out with scripts he could use on anyone willing to listen. This process also satisfied something deeper. As a boy abandoned early, stripped of consistent love and belonging, control offered him security the outside world never gave. Manipulation turned disappointment into victory. If others failed him or rejected him, he could rewrite the interaction by bending them to his will instead. Inside the prison logic of control and advantage, he found a language that matched his experiences. It gave structure to a life that had seen little stability. Words and behavior became weapons, and each success confirmed that he could never again allow himself to be powerless before others. When his sentences ended and he was released again, he carried far more than an ordinary criminal record. He carried the tricks, postures, and persuasive strategies honed through years of trial inside controlled environments. He was no longer only the petty thief who stole cars and forged checks. He had become someone who could walk into a room and sense what people wanted. Someone who could pretend to be anything they needed him to be long enough to win loyalty or obedience. These were skills that gave him an advantage far beyond simple crime. These were the tools that, in the right cultural setting, would make him appear magnetic. The prisons had not broken him, though they had tried. Instead, they crafted him into a different kind of offender, one who did not simply lash out, but who could shape the emotions of those around him. They had not turned him toward reform. They had given him a laboratory to practice deception until it worked on nearly everyone he met. By the end of his time inside, the transformation was clear. The walls had contained his body, but his mind had been shaping strategies to gain the kind of control he believed was owed to him. And when those walls finally opened in the late 1960s, they did not release a boy shaped by punishment. They released a man carrying an arsenal of manipulative skills into a world that was already searching for guidance and belonging. It was into that world, alive with counterculture, restless youth, and open rejection of authority, that Charles Manson would step next. In 1967, a hardened criminal walked into San Francisco and found a stage already waiting for him. Charles Manson had just been released from years behind bars. He was older than most of the people gathering in the city's Haight-Ashbury neighborhood, which had become the symbol of a new counterculture. Streets crowded with teenagers and young adults who had left home in search of freedom, love, and community. Music poured from open doors, drugs flowed freely, and in almost every direction people were talking about change. To the outside observer, it was a generation claiming peace. To Manson, it was a new environment full of possibility. Haight-Ashbury was a neighborhood transformed. By the middle of the 1960s, San Francisco's streets no longer carried their earlier identity as working class. Instead, they had filled with thousands who believed society was broken and who were determined to live outside its rules. LSD was not simply a drug. It was treated as a path to higher understanding. Young people packed into apartments and old houses, sharing food, experiences, and ideas about love. The free love movement encouraged casual intimacy without long-term commitments. Authority was dismissed, traditional family structures abandoned, and religion replaced with experimental forms of belief. For Manson, recently released, this was a culture built on rejecting nearly everything he had grown up distrusting. The free medical clinic, offered by Dr. David Smith, became an entry point for many lost young people. It served as a resource for those struggling with bad drug reactions or looking for help as they experimented with substances like LSD and other psychedelics. Manson found himself in this landscape quickly. For a man who had never been comfortable in ordinary society, Haight-Ashbury offered him freedom from the obstacles that had defined his life until then. Nobody questioned his past. Nobody asked about his failures in correctional facilities. In an environment where so many were embracing new identities, Manson's criminal background did not stand out. But there was an edge to him that others in the neighborhood did not carry. Most of the people around him were teenagers, or in their early 20s. They had been raised in stable homes before venturing out. They sought experiences and ideals in rebellion against their parents' world. Manson, by contrast, brought a lifetime of rejection, punishment, and practice in manipulation. He was not escaping a comfortable suburb. He was arriving from years of confinement, and this difference gave him a vantage point the others did not share. Where they saw opportunity to lose themselves, he saw opportunity to take control. Drug use amplified this situation. LSD was viewed through the counterculture lens as a way to strip down the barriers between people and expose truth. Manson embraced the drug as well, but not in search of self-discovery. For him, psychedelics allowed openings where defense mechanisms collapsed, vulnerable moments when others under the influence were more suggestible. Trips that his peers used for exploration became, for Manson, tools to study reactions and to guide thinking. He began experimenting with guiding these sessions, acting as though he had access to special insight while others were under the influence. To young people unsure of themselves, it seemed almost spiritual, but to Manson, it was another test field. The culture of group identity proved to be a perfect setting. The counterculture embraced collectivism, with people drawn to living communally, sharing resources, and dissolving traditional ideas of independence. Manson saw how desperately many of them sought belonging in these new, quickly formed communities. Having never enjoyed stable belonging himself, he understood instinctively how to fill that need. He presented himself as someone who could give guidance, who had wisdom older than the crowd, and experiences rougher than theirs. His small size and quiet manner made him less threatening on the surface, but his words carried authority when he positioned himself as a man who had suffered and overcome. Authorities would also notice how starkly his personality appeared to shift during this time. In earlier records, he was described as an antisocial, manipulative inmate who struggled to follow rules. But in Haight-Ashbury, people described him as warm, open, and magnetic. He carried a guitar with him, sang songs in parks, and spoke about love in ways that resonated with the drifting teenagers looking for direction. The change was not genuine transformation, it was adaptation. Just as he had worn different masks inside prison to fit situations, Manson was now wearing the mask of a thoughtful guru outside. This raises a natural question. How did a man hardened by institutions adapt so perfectly to the softness of the counterculture? The answer lies in his years training with books about persuasion and psychological reading. The Haight-Ashbury neighborhood was full of people primed to believe in leaders who sounded confident. They rejected traditional authority but still craved guidance. And Manson, having practiced manipulation inside prisons, now found an audience willing to listen without suspicion. Every line he spoke about freedom and connection was backed by the performance skills he had honed when he needed to persuade guards or fellow inmates. Examples of his early recruiting show how directly he targeted the displaced, women who felt rejected by their families, young people who had left behind universities or stable homes, drifters who carried the weight of uncertainty. These were the ones who first came close to him. Manson presented himself as someone who would not judge them, who understood abandonment, who would provide a place where they were always included. For those who had felt invisible in their families, his attention appeared radiant. He offered the embrace of belonging and wrapped it in messages about love, freedom, and spiritual awakening. He did not do this in grand speeches on stages. He did it in small circles, around firelight, in borrowed apartments, or while sitting in fields playing his guitar. His style reflected intimacy rather than distance. New recruits felt as though they belonged to something rare, something that revealed itself only in personal connections. It was not about mass appeal, but about weaving loyalty, one person at a time. Women in particular became his first core followers, drawn by the mix of affection, promises of spiritual connection, and the illusion of safety he offered. In truth, his eye was not on mutual support, but on forming a base of control. The growing attachment of these followers demonstrated how quickly he learned to exploit the social shift around him. Counterculture sought community and family, but in open forms. Manson's offering of a family carried those ideals in language, but twisted them toward his own authority. Instead of everyone being equal, he began establishing patterns where he was the unquestioned figure in the center. He positioned himself as guide, teacher, even prophet. Around him, those who had been lonely felt seen for the first time. Those who had felt rejected now believed they had a purpose. And through this manipulation, Manson's long years of practice, reading and controlling people, now translated into devotion. The payoff of this moment is clear. A lifelong manipulator had stumbled onto a cultural stage where charisma counted more than credentials, where experience with systems of control could disguise itself as spiritual guidance. Unlike in prison, where manipulation brought him favors, in San Francisco it gave him loyal followers. At a time when young people were searching for leaders outside the traditions they rejected, Manson stepped forward with the appearance of wisdom that masked years of criminal craft. The cycle of rejection that had carved his youth, and the practice of manipulation he had rehearsed in institutions, now converged with the open atmosphere of the 1960s counterculture. He was no longer the boy abandoned by his mother or the man sitting in reform school. He was the central figure of small circles who praised him, followed him, and began orienting their lives around his words. The shift was extraordinary not because his personality had truly transformed, but because the stage had finally appeared for him to exploit. The world around him had opened an opportunity to mask control as love, and to recast manipulation as spiritual wisdom. But this awakening was not the end of his story. It was the beginning of a path where his words, his influence, and his role as a leader would expand beyond neighborhood street corners. The small groups gathering around him were not a finished movement. They were the framework of something about to grow larger. And as these circles expanded, the man who had trained himself to persuade and control now carried the chance to transform a handful of displaced followers into the earliest shape of what would later be known as the Manson family. What transformed Charles Manson's mind from that of a petty criminal into the creator of a violent worldview? His time in prison had given him tools of persuasion, but it was exposure to books, music, drugs, and spiritual systems during the late 1960s that stirred the foundation of what became his doomsday philosophy. None of these influences were destructive on their own. In fact, most of them were accepted parts of the era's culture. What mattered was how Manson pieced them together, twisting them into a worldview that gave him not only identity, but prophecy. One of the first influences came in the form of science fiction. The novel Stranger in a Strange Land, published in 1961 by Robert Heinlein, had become a popular book among young people drawn to new ideas about freedom, love, and spirituality. The story described a man from another planet who lived among humans, challenging customs and teaching followers to adopt a new way of life. It resonated with many in the counterculture because it questioned authority and described a community based on shared ideals. Manson read this novel and came to believe that he, like the central figure in the book, was meant to guide others into a new form of existence. While the novel was embraced by many readers without violent consequences, in Manson's hands it fueled the idea that he was destined to be a leader of a chosen family, separate from the larger society. Music also fed into this growing belief system. During the 1960s, the Beatles were at the height of their popularity, their songs spreading not only across the radio but into the heart of the counterculture. Manson listened to their records often, but he did not hear them the way most listeners did. While others enjoyed the music for its creativity or saw it as a soundtrack of freedom, Manson began to interpret the lyrics as coded messages. In particular, he believed certain songs were speaking directly to him, offering prophecy and confirmation that his mission was part of a grand design. Songs became messages, and messages became directives. In his world, the Beatles were not a band but a spiritual compass. LSD deepened this illusion. Long trips under the drug allowed him to spend hours, sometimes days, absorbed in patterns of thought that reinforced these ideas. Psychedelics alter perception, breaking down barriers between thoughts, and often making connections seem profound, even when they are not. In patients who are already suggestible or searching for meaning, LSD can reinforce delusions. For Manson, the drug seemed to validate the notion that he had unique insight. While under its influence, he would listen to Beatles records repeatedly, interpreting lines as revelations of coming destruction or promises of rising power. What others treated as a trip ended for him as a blueprint of prophecy. This was not limited to music. LSD made even ordinary conversations sound to him like confirmation of his role as a leader. Followers who were high became easier to guide, easier for him to convince that his words carried truth. In these long drug sessions, Manson trained himself to use his persuasive voice at the exact moments when others were most vulnerable. The combination of being under the drug and hearing him speak convinced several that they were sharing in visions of the future. To them, it was revelation. To Manson, it was evidence that his manipulation was working. Another influence that wove into his thinking was Scientology. He had been introduced to its study while in prison, reading about concepts of spiritual levels and the idea that the self could be shaped through mental techniques. Manson did not commit fully to Scientology the way some peers did, but he picked pieces of it that could serve his growing philosophy. He became interested in practices of self-exploration and how language could be used to break mental barriers. Just as with the Carnegie methods of persuasion he had once studied, Manson took from Scientology not its faith but its strategies. What he borrowed was the idea that humans could be reprogrammed, that identities could be stripped down and rebuilt into something new. When placed side by side, none of these influences seem inherently dangerous. Stranger in a Strange Land was a counterculture favorite without leading others into violence. Beatles music inspired joy and protest, but not cult prophecy in the majority of listeners. LSD was a common experiment among youth without producing movements of destruction in most who used it. Scientology, while controversial, did not direct followers toward crime. The danger appeared only when Manson stitched together fragments from each into one worldview. His imagination merged fiction, music, drugs, and spiritual theory into a system where society was collapsing, where he was the teacher chosen to lead survivors, and where violence could be justified as part of apocalyptic destiny. At the core of this worldview was the idea of a coming war of destruction. Manson told his followers that the world was on the edge of collapse and that racial conflict would explode into chaos. He presented this war not as fear but as opportunity, claiming that he and his family of followers would emerge as the survivors chosen to lead the new world. The Beatles' music, according to him, laid out the map of this war. LSD gave him images convincing enough to solidify prophecy, and books like Stranger in a Strange Land gave him the structure of a family led by a prophetic teacher. Psychologists later explained that the effect of such combinations on suggestible minds can be significant. In vulnerable groups, leaders who mix familiar cultural symbols like music with altered drug states can appear to have direct access to hidden truth. The mind, already disarmed by the drug or by emotional need, accepts connections that seem obvious in those moments but unrealistic otherwise. This process was at the center of how Manson gained power. Each influence magnified the others, weaving a net of belief around those willing to listen. His philosophy was not consistent from one day to the next. Details shifted depending on who he was talking to or what music he had heard most recently, but the broad outline stayed firm. The world was ending. The signs were present in songs, in visions, and in cultural unrest. He was the interpreter of those signs, and those who followed him would inherit the future. Doctrine did not matter as much as devotion. If his followers believed he had access to hidden truth, the details could always be modified to suit the moment. This was a turning point in his evolution as a manipulator. Before, His control was limited to prisons and small circles where favors or safety were the rewards. Now, he was shaping belief systems. He was not only getting favors, he was directing lives. The philosophy he stitched together was not about consistency. It was about giving meaning to people who had arrived in San Francisco feeling lost. Music told them what would happen. LSD made them feel they experienced it themselves. Books and spiritual talk gave it form, and Manson stood at the center, presenting himself as the only one who could bring it all together. For followers, this philosophy offered purpose far stronger than the casual freedom of the counterculture. Instead of wandering without direction, they were suddenly part of history written in their own time. Their teacher told them they were chosen, members of a family that would outlast destruction. The words, the drugs, the music, and the sermons tied them together under his authority. This was Manson's power taking its next step. No longer small-time manipulation, but large-scale control born out of twisted prophecy. The significance of this period cannot be measured by individual acts of crime, but by the creation of an intellectual structure that would justify crime later. Without this philosophy, the group might have stayed a loose circle of wanderers. With it, they believed they were living in revelation and preparing for destiny. The instructions Manson gave them carried weight not because they were reasonable, but because they were linked to what seemed like undeniable signs from music, visions, and prophecy. What began as a mix of influences available to anyone in the 1960s became, in Manson's hands, the foundation of an apocalyptic belief system. His petty criminal mind had been transformed into something more powerful, blending culture and manipulation into prophecy. No longer did he see himself only as a man searching for survival. He had cast himself as a messenger whose words stood on equal ground with the music of the biggest band in the world, the pages of a celebrated novel, and the intense visions of mind-altering drugs. It gave him identity. It gave him prophecy. And it gave him justification to draw others closer under his rule. These newly formed ideas did not stay abstract. They served as the ground on which he built devotion. The followers who listened to him in the late 1960s were not joining a petty thief's circle. They were stepping into what they believed was a family guided by destiny and chosen truth. And in that space, under his growing charisma and his voice framed by prophecy, Charles Manson moved from being a manipulator of individuals to the leader of a movement. Soon, those ideas would transform not just minds but actions, binding followers in loyalty that reached far beyond ordinary influence. How did a homeless ex-convict with no money gather a devoted circle around him? In San Francisco, where the streets overflowed with runaways and seekers, Charles Manson found the answer. He had nothing in the way society measured success. No career, no home, no wealth. Yet he carried something powerful, an ability to read others and offer them exactly what they thought they were missing. Out of this, the first outlines of his following began to take shape. Mary Brunner was among the first drawn to him. At the time, she was working as a librarian in Berkeley. On the surface, her life appeared orderly. A college graduate with a respectable job, living alone in her apartment, but like many others in that era, she felt disconnected from the culture around her. Manson spotted that need almost immediately. He moved in with her, despite having nothing to contribute financially, and began speaking about freedom, love, and rejection in ways that resonated with someone who had long felt like an outsider. Before long, her apartment became the earliest hub of his growing family. Not long after came others, like Lynette, Squeaky from. She, too, was young, disillusioned, and looking for meaning. It was not unusual in Haight-Ashbury to meet people in transition, drifting from one group to another with little direction. Manson offered a kind of clarity. He assured them they were special and that they were seen, which for people who felt invisible or abandoned carried enormous weight. Where society had failed to provide belonging, he wrapped authority and love together, promising both without admitting the control hidden inside it. The counterculture had opened space for this to happen. Thousands of youths had left traditional households, rejecting their parents' authority and testing new lifestyles. But freedom was not always grounding. Many of them wandered into feelings of despair or isolation. Manson filled this gap by presenting himself as someone older, claiming insights that came not from school or career but from struggle and pain. To those standing on uncertain ground, his stories of rejection and transformation sounded like wisdom. He positioned himself as a teacher rather than a criminal, speaking in simple but deliberate terms. Often, his words circled around ideas of love and connection, offering the impression that he understood the struggles of each listener personally. He invited them to see themselves as part of something bigger, a circle where judgment was erased. The strategy worked. Instead of warning them about the dangers of his past, he rebranded his rejection by society as proof that he alone understood what it meant to be cast out. For people disillusioned with mainstream culture, there was a strange comfort in following someone who claimed to have nothing, yet offered belonging. Communal living became the foundation of his growing influence. The group took to the road in old cars or vans, traveling for days and stopping wherever they could find shelter. On road trips, Manson kept their spirits up with constant music. He strummed his guitar, sang songs he had written, and filled silences with stories about his past and predictions for the future. For young people eager to hear meaning in every experience, his words turned ordinary drives into spiritual journeys. They camped out or stayed in borrowed homes, living by sharing food, favors, and the little money that occasionally came in from odd jobs or thefts. Life outside conventional rules began to feel like adventure, with Manson guiding each step. His teachings early on sounded harmless, even appealing. He spoke about love as the purest force, about letting go of material possessions, and about trusting one another over outsiders. Rejection, which had tormented him all his life, was remade into a lesson he shared with them that outsiders would never understand, but within the family, they had each other. Belonging came at the cost of loyalty to him, though he often disguised it as loyalty to the group as a whole. This reframing gave his followers a sense of safety and freedom they had not felt elsewhere. But it was control in disguise. Over time, it became clear that these weren't just friends gathering together. They were moving toward discipleship. Manson cast himself as more than a teacher. He spoke about reincarnation, suggesting to his followers that they were prophets returning again, destined for a new era. To be told by Manson that one carried the spirit of a prophet was intoxicating. For young women already wondering who they were in the world, it granted identity and importance. Suddenly, they were no longer drifters or outcasts. They were spiritual figures in a family with a cosmic purpose. The methods he used were subtle but relentless. Praise alternated with criticism, keeping followers seeking his approval. Intimacy through sex was framed as love, but worked as a bond of control. LSD trips became spiritual tests guided by his voice, reinforcing the idea that his words carried power even in altered states. The rituals, songs, storytelling, trips, and nightly conversations wove loyalty into daily routine. Even when his teachings shifted from positivity to darker themes, the foundation of attachment was already secure. The travels extended beyond San Francisco. The group wandered through California, stopping in rural areas, hitchhiking, borrowing homes, and continuing their communal living. They operated as one body, with Manson at the center. Followers became accustomed to living without possessions, eating when food was available, and thinking less about personal needs and more about what the family required. This shift tied them closer to him, especially since he was the one interpreting every hardship and every bit of fortune as part of their journey. Obstacles became lessons, confirmed by his constant narrative. Manson's skill lay in making those around him believe everyone had a role, but only he could define it. When doubts arose, he turned them back on the follower, suggesting they were too attached to material concerns or too caught up in ego. In doing so, he tightened the circle of belief. To belong, each member had to abandon personal doubts and accept his vision without challenge. Over time, this dynamic replaced ordinary friendship with dependency. Looking back, it is striking that what seemed benevolent, at first teachings about love and freedom, were laying the groundwork for control. The same language that made new followers feel welcome was used to strip them of individuality. By convincing them that rejection from mainstream society was inevitable, but that his family offered total acceptance, Manson created a situation where leaving felt unthinkable. Loyalty to him promised safety from the rejection they feared most. At the beginning, his following was small, but even with only a handful of women and drifters, the pattern was visible. Manson needed control, and the lost young people he encountered needed direction. That exchange gave him the authority he had long been denied, and gave them the feeling of belonging society had failed to provide. It was in this space, between his hunger for control and their hunger for love, that the Manson family first began to exist. The earliest followers did not see themselves as joining a cult or giving up their freedom. They thought they were embracing liberation, guided by a man who promised understanding and insight. In truth, they were stepping into a system that bound them tighter with every lesson, every trip, every night on the road. These were not ordinary friendships forming in the late 1960s counterculture. They were the first links in a chain of loyalty designed to keep people within his orbit. By the time the family began to draw more attention, the people closest to Manson were already fixed in their devotion. Isolation from families, daily life guided by his stories, and belief in his spiritual authority had created a group that would follow wherever he led. His promise of love and belonging had drawn them in, but control held them together. His teachings about reincarnation and prophecy gave their lives meaning they felt society had stripped away, and his role as teacher, guide, and prophet placed him at the center of every decision. The payoff became clear in these years. Manson, a man who had spent his life rejected and manipulated by others, discovered a community where he could finally dictate the terms. Lonely Seekers gave him the audience, counterculture gave him the stage, and his well-practiced skills of persuasion gave him the script. Out of this came not scattered friendships, but discipleship. He had turned being homeless and powerless into a position of leadership that bound others closely to him. This small circle of devoted followers was only the beginning. Their loyalty, built on promises of love and unity, would soon carry them into places far beyond the streets of San Francisco. And through unexpected connections, their teacher, the man who had once lived only within the walls of institutions, was about to find himself stepping into the world of Hollywood, searching for recognition that would only sharpen his hunger for significance. A chance encounter with a rock star almost gave Charles Manson the fame he had always dreamed of. The moment came not through planning, but by accident. In the summer of 1968, Dennis Wilson, drummer for the Beach Boys, was driving home when he spotted a pair of hitchhiking women. These women were not random strangers. They were part of Manson's small but growing circle. Wilson offered them a ride, took them to his home, and went about his day without realizing that one of the most dangerous figures of the decade would soon enter his life. When Wilson returned later that night, Manson himself was standing in his driveway. With that, the world of Hollywood and the world of Charles Manson collided. Wilson was at the height of fame at the time. The Beach Boys had sold millions of records and had become one of the most well-known bands in America. His California mansion was filled with the energy of wealth, music, and constant parties. For Manson, who was still living off the goodwill of women and small thefts, it was a world he had never experienced. Wilson welcomed him inside, thinking he was showing kindness to a struggling musician and the women traveling with him. Manson immediately recognized what this access meant. Hollywood, with its powerful audiences and endless channels of influence, could be the stage he had always imagined for spreading his message. Once inside Wilson's home, Manson and his followers became regular fixtures. They brought with them their usual lifestyle of drugs, sex, and communal living, activities that fit in naturally with the party culture surrounding many musicians at the time. Wilson was intrigued by Manson, who carried a guitar and sang his own songs with intensity. The music was not polished, and the lyrics were often rambling, but Manson performed with conviction. He believed his words carried hidden truths, messages about freedom, spirituality, and the coming changes in the world. Wilson enjoyed the rawness and treated Manson as a kind of quirky guest with unusual talent. At first, it seemed harmless. For Manson, this was not about harmless fun. He believed music could spread his vision faster and further than sermons at a street corner. If he could record, get airplay, and share his word through the most popular medium of the time, he could step fully into the role he wanted. Wilson gave him the chance. He introduced Manson to other musicians, producers, and industry figures, including connections at recording studios. For a short time, Manson was allowed to bring his music into professional spaces, standing in the same rooms where famous artists shaped records that reached millions. Each introduction fed his ego, convincing him that true fame was within reach. Manson began carrying himself as if success was already guaranteed. Around his followers, he claimed the Beach Boys would make him famous, that his songs would soon inspire the nation the way the Beatles already had. He spoke with new confidence, mixing his music with his philosophy. His ego swelled with every meeting, and he began to tell his followers that recognition would not only make him powerful, it would make them eternal. The music was more than personal ambition. It was the vessel for what he called his prophecy. Subtle problems showed themselves early. For one, Manson's followers did not respect the boundaries of a celebrity's home. Wilson's mansion became crowded with strangers. Manson's so-called family, who used the space as if it were their own. Scenes of naked swimming in the pool, free-flowing drugs, and reckless living became normal inside Wilson's once private home. Property was damaged, bills stacked up, and Wilson's finances showed signs of strain. Studio executives grew uneasy when Manson appeared with his ragged group, whose behavior was unpredictable. Many in Hollywood had experimented with counterculture, but Manson carried a darker, more intense energy that unsettled those who observed him closely. The music itself became a sticking point. While Wilson appreciated some of Manson's raw style, others in the industry were less impressed. Producers turned him away, citing his lack of focus and unusual lyrics. Manson could not manage the professionalism expected in a recording studio. What he considered profound often sounded scattered or incoherent to experienced ears. Frustration built as he realized fame might not be as easy as stepping into Wilson's circle. This rejection touched a deep nerve that had haunted him since childhood. Once again, he felt that others failed to see his worth. Wilson had believed in him at first, but the industry itself was cold, selective, and unwilling to buy into his vision. Conflict also grew in Wilson's home. Manson's family consumed resources with no concern for repayment. They wrecked cars, spread chaos, and drained hospitality. Wilson tried to manage the situation at first, but Manson's behavior became more unsettling. He began showcasing a controlling side, treating the women around him as his property, and speaking openly about his coming vision of an apocalyptic future. Friends of Wilson who saw Manson in that period described his presence as eerie, his intensity unnerving. What had begun as curiosity turned into concern. Eventually, Wilson had enough. He cut ties, distancing himself from Manson and his followers. For Manson, the collapse of this promise of fame was not merely disappointment, it was devastating. He had edged close to the success he dreamed of, only to feel it snatched away. Rejection, already the wound of his past, repeated itself in the world of Hollywood. Rejection from that world did more than sting. It reshaped his bitterness into fury. He told his followers that the industry was corrupt, that people in power were blind to truth, and that fate had once again turned against him. Betrayal became his narrative, reminding his group that outsiders could never be trusted. The rejection also solidified in him a sense of opposition. If Hollywood would not embrace him, he would stand against it. This opposition grew into part of his prophecy, convincing his followers that society itself, including its stars and idols, would collapse. They alone would survive and rise. What had started as a bid for success now transformed into confirmation of his darker beliefs. Hollywood was not his stage. It was his enemy. The irony was sharp. The Beach Boys did record one of Manson's songs, but they altered the lyrics, released it under a different title, and gave him no credit. To most listeners, it was simply another Beach Boys track. To Manson, it was theft and evidence of betrayal. What he had written as spiritual guidance became pop music stripped of meaning. His resentment deepened, and with it, his conviction that the mainstream world would never recognize him as he believed he deserved. The disappointment with Hollywood did more than fuel his anger. It changed the course of his influence. Instead of chasing fame in the studios, he turned back fully to his followers. If he could not capture millions through music, he would intensify his control over the family he already had. If society would not give him a stage, then he would create one of his own. In time, that stage would be Spahn Ranch, the isolated and decaying film set on the edge of Los Angeles. There, he would no longer rely on the acceptance of outsiders. He would build a closed world where his voice was the only one that carried authority, where rejection could no longer be delivered by someone more powerful than him. Hollywood had offered him a glimpse of fame, but denied him recognition. That denial was not the end of his reach. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where his hunger for significance would grow more dangerous, away from the spotlight, but deep inside the hearts of those who followed him. At Wilson's mansion, Manson had tested his appeal in the glamour of celebrity life. He saw how close he could come to the recognition he longed for. But when it slipped away, his bitterness cemented into purpose. Rejection was no longer something to endure. It became proof of his destiny. And that proof, in his mind, justified gathering his family more tightly under his control, convincing them that Hollywood's betrayal was only the beginning of a greater struggle. That struggle, he promised, would bring them victory after the world collapsed. From the lights of Wilson's mansion, Manson had been pushed back into the shadows. Those shadows would soon become the backdrop to something far more destructive: the rise of a cult at Spahn Ranch. Why did an abandoned Hollywood film set become the perfect ground for a cult leader? For Charles Manson, the move to Spahn Ranch was not only about finding shelter, but about creating a stage where his control over followers could stretch to its limit. The ranch itself was a forgotten relic from another time. Once it had been a bustling backdrop for Western movies, filled with horses, cameras, and stars. By the late 1960s, though, it was quiet and decaying. Old wooden buildings leaned under years of neglect. The faded signs of saloon doors stood mostly as decoration, and the dust that clung to everything reminded visitors of its abandonment. Remote yet close enough to Los Angeles, Spahn Ranch sat in the isolated hills of Chatsworth, cut off from the rhythms of ordinary life. For many of Manson's followers, the isolation only added to its appeal. They had already separated themselves from families and norms. Now they stepped into a place where time felt suspended. The sense of distance reinforced the idea that they were creating something independent of the rest of society. It also removed them from outside voices that might have questioned what was happening. George Spahn, the ranch's aging owner, had inherited long-abandoned film sets and a run-down horse-riding business. By then, he was old and nearly blind. His property mostly brought visitors looking for horseback rides through the rugged trails. The few ranch hands who remained did what they could, but Spahn struggled to maintain the place. When Manson and his group arrived, they offered labor and companionship in exchange for staying there. To Spahn, who had limited resources and needed help, this seemed like a fair trade. For Manson, it was a perfect opportunity. What began as shelter quickly became something much more. Manson organized his followers into a system where every day required service to him, to the group, and to the ranch. The women in the group especially carried the responsibilities of caring for George Spahn. Because he was blind, they cooked for him, cleaned his home, and provided him company. In return, he allowed Manson's entire family to stay on the property without rent. It was a barter arrangement, but one that gave Manson the freedom to expand his influence with no interruptions from landlords or authorities asking questions. Daily life at Spahn Ranch soon followed patterns that reinforced his control. Chores kept the group busy and dependent. Followers cared for horses, washed clothes, cooked meals, and kept the ranch relatively functional. LSD trips became routine, often directed by Manson himself, where altered states of mind were used as lessons. Followers under the drug were more vulnerable to his influence, and he used these moments to deepen their loyalty. Any hesitation or question could be swept away during trips, in which he was positioned as the guide, leading them through visions and truths. Sexual relationships were another element woven into daily life. Manson manipulated his followers by framing intimacy as a way to dissolve barriers and prove devotion. What outsiders would have seen as exploitation was painted inside the group as freedom and love. By controlling who could sleep with whom and when, he reinforced his position at the center of every personal decision. Followers were discouraged from holding attachments outside of him, so even relationships were filtered through his authority. This ensured that no loyalty outweighed the connection they had to him. What emerged resembled the structure of earlier institutions Manson had lived in, but this time he was running it, instead of being controlled by it. His followers were engaged in chores, schedules, controlled activities, and rituals, much like he had once been in reform schools and prisons. The crucial difference was that now the authority figure was him. The echoes of institutional life became part of what stabilized him. Where most saw a desolate ranch, Manson saw walls without fences. Within those bounds, his words became law. The isolation helped intensify the belief system he had been shaping since San Francisco. The sermons about love evolved into darker prophecies. He began teaching his group that society was on the brink of collapse. Conversations turned into predictions about an approaching apocalypse. He told them that a great conflict between races would explode and destroy the current order. He used music he interpreted, drug-fueled visions, and his own imagination to convince them that their role was to survive and rise as the victors of this coming destruction. The idea, which he called helter-skelter, became a core theme of his talks. On the ranch, away from society, he could repeat it daily, mixing fragments of songs, news stories, and his own narrative, until it felt inescapable to his followers. Every chore, trip, and conversation linked back to this prophecy. For those trying to live freely, the prospect of being chosen survivors made their wandering lives feel suddenly important. They were no longer just drifters. They were central players in history itself. This environment also made his control appear natural. Everyone depended on him not just for leadership but for meaning. To live at Spahn Ranch meant living by his interpretation of events. The ranch's decaying film set reinforced the illusion that they were living in a story larger than themselves, acting out parts in a grand narrative only he could direct. External voices rarely intruded, so doubts and conflicts had little space to survive. If questions emerged, Manson answered with prophecy, LSD sessions, or sexual control. The followers adapted quickly. What had once been normal behaviors, private decisions about intimacy, independent thinking, small personal freedoms were gradually stripped away. In their place grew rituals and beliefs that bound them more deeply. A cook preparing food was not only feeding fellow travelers, she was sustaining the chosen family. Someone caring for George Spahn was not just helping an elderly man. She was reinforcing the foundation of their home and their prophecy. With every role redefined, everyday tasks became acts of devotion. By repeating lessons in cycles, Manson made his grip appear absolute. This mirrored the loops of punishment and lesson he had learned in reform school. Back then, he had been the victim of discipline. Now, he was its enforcer. He taught his group that punishment came not from him, but from breaking the unity of the family or resisting destiny. The echoes of his childhood environment were unmistakable. Where he had once felt discarded and powerless, he now designed a system where he was central, admired, and feared in equal measure. The ranch created a physical embodiment of his past struggles. It was secluded like the correctional facilities that had defined his youth, complete with strict routines. Only this time, the confinement was voluntary, or at least appeared to be. Followers could technically leave, but for most the thought felt impossible. Isolation, LSD, and teachings tied them closer with each passing day. Just as he had once accepted institutional life as natural, his followers came to see life at Spahn Ranch as the only reality that mattered. This arrangement transformed Manson from a manipulator of individuals into something more stable, the unquestioned leader of a closed community. The ranch gave him a controlled environment where his words were rarely challenged, where the outside world seemed like an illusion, and where prophecy was the only truth. It was both a kingdom and a cage, one in which he trapped not just his followers, but also himself, in a spiral of belief that grew darker. By the end of their time at Spahn Ranch, the followers were no longer simply living communally or seeking counterculture freedom. They were enacting rituals of submission and prophecy, believing their teacher's vision that destruction was near and that they would rise from its ashes. The environment had achieved exactly what Manson had long desired, a place where rejection no longer threatened him, where authority rested in his hands, and where dependency kept others bound to his rule. The ranch, once home to staged gunfights for Hollywood films, had become the setting for a real story of manipulation and control. Its silence, its decay, and its isolation gave Manson the perfect space to replicate the confinement he had always known, but now as the enforcer, rather than the boy trapped inside. The payoff was clear. Spahn Ranch gave him not just shelter and followers, but a psychological dominance rooted in patterns he had rehearsed all his life. What began as a rustic film location offered him a stage more powerful than the spotlight of Hollywood ever could. It gave him the closed world he needed to prepare loyal followers for the violent acts his new philosophy demanded. Soon, those teachings would move from words and rituals into actions that left a permanent scar on history. Charles Manson's life shows how rejection and punishment can harden into control. From a boy shuffled between foster homes to an inmate learning manipulation, every stage added to the tools he later used. His family of followers at Spahn Ranch did not come from nowhere. It was the result of years of surviving instability by stripping away trust and replacing it with power. A boy left behind by family became a man who convinced others to silence their conscience. His story is not about excuses. It is a lesson in how broken systems can shape broken people into monsters.